At my own 75th Christmas dinner, my wife of 40 years slammed divorce papers onto our Michelin-starred table. Her 92-year-old father cackled, telling me a black maintenance worker never belonged in his family anyway. My daughter-in-law smirked, saying my grandkids would never visit my future slum. They shoved a $4,500 bill in my face, mocking my meager pension. I did not yell. I just handed the waiter a faded, heavy black metal card I had kept hidden since 1969. When the manager saw the name, he rushed over, bowed deeply, and whispered a truth that drained the color from all their faces. Before I tell you what he said, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe karma always collects its debts. The heavy smack of the manila envelope hitting the crisp white linen of the restaurant table cut through the soft jazz playing in the background. It was Christmas Eve at one of Chicago's most exclusive dining rooms. Vivien, my wife of 40 years, slid the thick stack of papers right over my plate of untouched sea bass. I did not even blink. I just looked at the bold black letters on the front. Petition for dissolution of marriage. I looked up at Vivien. She was 70, but trying desperately to look 50, dripping in the pearls I had supposedly bought her with my overtime pay. She did not look sad. She looked triumphant. Vivien leaned back, swirling her $200 glass of wine. She announced loudly enough for the neighboring tables to hear that she was done. She said she was tired of pretending. She was tired of smelling industrial soap on my clothes every evening. She told me she had found a real man, an investor she called him, someone who actually knew how to multiply money instead of scrubbing grease off rich people's floors. I kept my face entirely blank. A 75-year-old black man learns early in life that silence is the heaviest armor you can wear. I did not give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Next to her sat Harlon, her 92-year-old father. His hands shook from age, but his racist venom was as steady as ever. He let out a dry, rattling laugh and pointed a crooked finger at me. He told me he always knew this day would come. He said a black plumber should never have been allowed to sit at his dinner table, let alone marry his daughter. He told me to pack my cheap bags and get ready to live under a bridge where people of my pedigree belong. He chuckled, saying the cold Chicago winter would finally teach me my place in the world. I shifted my gaze to my son Andre, 40 years old, wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than my first car. He stared intently at his mashed potatoes, too much of a coward to look his own father in the eye. Beside him sat Khloe, his 38-year-old wife. She smoothed her blonde hair and let out a condescending sigh. She told me not to expect any weekend visits with the grandchildren. She said she absolutely refused to let her kids set foot in whatever crime-ridden slum I would be forced to rent on a fixed income. She said it was a matter of safety and standard of living. Andre just nodded slightly, validating her insult with his pathetic silence. The sheer audacity of it all was almost poetic. For decades, I had played the role of the humble maintenance worker. I drove a beat-up Ford truck. I wore stained denim. I let them believe Vivien was the financial genius of the family, managing our meager savings so well that Andre could somehow afford a $2 million mansion and luxury cars. They thought they were the elite. They thought I was the dead weight dragging them down. They had no idea that my silence was a test they were failing spectacularly. I remembered the nights I worked late just to keep my cover intact while secretly managing a portfolio that controlled half the commercial real estate in the city. Then the waiter arrived carrying a sleek leather booklet. He placed it delicately in the center of the table. The bill, $4,500 for a single meal. Vivien grabbed the leather booklet, glanced at the astronomical total, and shoved it directly into my chest. She smiled a vicious, nasty smile. She called it my final gift to the family. She told me to drain my pathetic little pension account and pay for the people who had tolerated my presence for 4 decades. Harlon chuckled again, telling me I better start washing dishes in the back if my card declined. Khloe rolled her eyes, muttering that it was embarrassing to even be seen with me in a place like this. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my worn jacket. I bypassed the cheap leather wallet they all recognized. Instead, my fingers traced the cold, heavy edges of a solid black metal card. It was faded at the corners. It had no modern chip, no bank logo they would recognize. It was a private trust-issued card I had received from my late uncle back in 1969. My uncle was one of the pioneer black businessmen in Chicago, a man who built a real estate empire in this city when the odds were completely stacked against him. He taught me that true wealth is invisible until the exact moment you need it to be a weapon. And tonight, I was drawing my weapon. I placed the heavy black metal onto the silver tray. The waiter picked it up. He glanced at the strange card, frowned slightly, and walked toward the register. Vivien snickered, asking if that was some sort of food stamp card. She told Andre to get his wallet ready because my blue-collar bank was going to block the transaction. I just took a sip of my water. I watched the second hand on my watch tick away. I knew exactly what was happening at the register. The terminal would not read a normal bank code. It would trigger a direct line to the private wealth management firm that oversaw my family trust. 2 minutes later, the waiter did not return. The general manager of the restaurant did. He was practically sprinting across the dining room floor, his face pale sweat beading on his forehead. He bypassed Vivien. He ignored Harlon. He stopped directly next to my chair and bowed so deeply his tie almost touched the table. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Mr. Sterling, I am so incredibly sorry for the delay. Your money is no good here, sir." Vivien scoffed, demanding to know what the manager was talking about. She told him I was just a broke janitor and that he needed to run the card again because I was trying to skip out on the bill. The manager did not even look at her. He kept his eyes respectfully lowered to me and said the words that would destroy their reality forever. "Sir, this entire building, the restaurant, the real estate it sits on, it is all owned by your trust. Your meal is complimentary, as is everything else in this establishment. We are honored by your presence." The silence that fell over my family was absolute. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears. Harlon dropped his fork, clattering against his porcelain plate. Khloe choked on her breath, her eyes darting between me and the bowing manager. Andre finally looked up, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror. Vivien sat frozen, her jaw unhinged, her expensive wine glass slipping slightly in her trembling hand. They had spent 40 years mocking a man they thought was beneath them. They had spent the last 20 minutes stripping away my dignity. But in a matter of seconds, one sentence from a restaurant manager shattered their entire universe. The realization was crashing down on them like a collapsing skyscraper. The poor black maintenance worker they had treated like garbage was the landlord of the most expensive building in the city. The money they thought Vivien was cleverly investing was actually my money quietly funneled into their accounts to keep up their pathetic facade of superiority. I calmly picked up the sleek black pen from the table. I pulled the divorce papers toward me. I did not read the terms Vivien had so carefully drafted to strip me of my supposed meager savings. I flipped straight to the last page and signed my name with a slow, deliberate flourish. I stood up, tossed the signed papers right onto Vivien's lap, and looked down at the people who had just thrown away a billionaire. My voice was calm, carrying no anger, just the cold, hard truth of their new reality. "You have your freedom, Vivien," I said quietly. "But as of this exact second, your invisible funding is permanently cut off. Good luck with your investor." I turned my back on them and walked out the front doors into the freezing Chicago night, leaving them at the table to face the absolute ruin of their own making. The game of pretending was over. Now the real consequences were going to begin. The morning after Christmas was supposed to be a day of hangovers and unwrapping expensive gifts at my son Andre's $2 million estate in the suburbs. Instead, it became the first day of his financial apocalypse. The temperature in Chicago had dropped below zero, but the real freeze was happening inside his bank accounts. At exactly 8 in the morning, Khloe walked out to their heated driveway. She was wrapped in a silk robe, holding a cup of artisanal coffee, looking every bit the entitled suburban housewife. She pressed the ignition button on her brand-new white Range Rover. Nothing happened. The engine did not roar to life. The dashboard remained completely dark. She huffed in annoyance, muttering about incompetent mechanics, and walked over to Andre's sleek silver Porsche. She tried his spare key. Dead. Both luxury vehicles were completely bricked. They were not broken. They were remotely disabled. Inside the sprawling marble kitchen, Andre was staring at his laptop screen. His face was the color of wet ash. He hit refresh on his banking portal for the 5th time, his hands shaking so violently he could barely use the mouse. The numbers did not change. His primary checking account, his savings, his joint credit lines with Khloe, everything showed a big red 0 or an access denied error. The invisible safety net he had been resting on for his entire adult life had vanished overnight. Khloe stormed back into the house, slamming the heavy oak door. She yelled at Andre that the cars were broken, and demanded he call the dealership immediately to complain. Andre did not answer her. He just kept clicking his mouse, his breathing shallow and rapid. When Khloe finally marched over and looked at the screen, she dropped her coffee mug. It shattered against the imported Italian tiles, splashing dark liquid everywhere. She asked him where the money went. She screamed at him, demanding to know if he had been hacked or if his firm had frozen his bonuses. Andre could only whisper 2 words: "My father." While panic consumed their pristine suburban mansion, I was sitting in my actual home. It was not a cramped apartment or a crumbling shack in the slums like my former father-in-law Harlon had so gleefully predicted. It was a sprawling penthouse on the top floor of a high-rise overlooking the freezing waters of Lake Michigan. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, a skyline I owned a significant piece of. I sat at my mahogany desk sipping a cup of black coffee, watching the snow fall over the city. I opened my private wealth management portal on my computer. For 15 years, I had been funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars through a maze of anonymous shell companies to fund Andre's illusion of success. I did it to keep peace in my house. I did it because Vivien demanded a son she could brag about at her country club luncheons. When Andre failed his first business venture, I quietly bought his debts. When he could not afford the mortgage on that massive estate to impress his new white wife, I set up a corporate entity to buy the property and let him live there for free. I let Vivien believe she was a genius investor. I let Andre believe he was a self-made man. I let Khloe believe she had married into white-collar royalty. I played the quiet, humble maintenance worker because true power never needs to announce itself. But they mistook my silence for weakness. They mistook my patience for stupidity. They thought my blue-collar uniform meant I was uneducated and helpless. No more. I clicked on the standing order for the monthly $50,000 wire transfer that sustained their lavish lifestyle. The screen prompted me for confirmation. I did not hesitate. I clicked cancel. Then I moved to the vehicle lease agreements. Both the Porsche and the Range Rover were corporate leases under my primary holdings company. I triggered the remote immobilizer protocol for non-payment. It took less than 3 minutes to dismantle a 40-year lie. I closed the laptop. The silence in my penthouse was beautiful. It was the sound of absolute freedom. I had carried their dead weight for decades, and cutting the cord felt like taking my first real breath of air. Back in the suburbs, the doorbell rang at Andre's house. It was not a neighbor bringing leftover Christmas ham. It was a process server, a man in a cheap brown suit holding a thick manila folder. Khloe ripped the door open, her face red from screaming at her husband. The man asked for Andre. Andre shuffled to the door, looking like a ghost of the arrogant man he was the night before. The server handed him the folder, stated he had been formally served, and walked away down the frozen driveway. Khloe snatched the folder from Andre's hands before he could even open it. She tore out the papers and began to read. Her eyes darted frantically across the legal jargon. It was a formal 30-day eviction notice, but it was not from a bank. It was from a property management firm representing a limited liability company. Khloe read the name of the company out loud: Sterling Heritage Holdings. She looked at Andre, her voice trembling with a toxic mix of rage and absolute terror. She screamed at him, asking what this meant. She demanded to know why they were being evicted from a house they owned. Andre finally looked at her, his cowardly facade crumbling into tiny, pathetic pieces. He admitted the truth he had been hiding even from himself. He confessed that they did not own the house. They never owned the house. He admitted that his mysterious angel investor, the one who bailed him out a decade ago and bought the deed, was not some Wall Street firm. It was his father. The same black maintenance worker Khloe had just banned her children from visiting. The same man Harlon had mocked. The same man Vivien had discarded like garbage. Khloe backed away from him as if he were carrying a lethal disease. The entitlement that had defined her entire existence shattered in real time. She realized that every designer handbag, every luxury vacation, every square foot of her perfect suburban life had been paid for by the man she had sneered at just 12 hours ago. The man she considered beneath her social status was actually the landlord of her entire life. She began to hyperventilate. She screamed that she was not going to be homeless. She grabbed her phone, dialing numbers frantically, threatening to call the police, to call her lawyers, to call anyone who would listen to a wealthy woman in distress. But she was no longer a wealthy woman. She was a tenant who was 30 days away from the street. She was about to learn that all the privilege in the world means absolutely nothing when the man holding the deed decides to lock the doors. Andre collapsed onto the living room sofa, burying his face in his hands. He picked up his phone and stared at my number. He was too terrified to call, but too desperate not to. The invisible umbilical cord of my funding was completely severed. The consequences of their cruelty were no longer a distant threat or a hypothetical scenario. They were standing right on their front porch holding an eviction notice, and the best part was that I did not even have to raise my voice to destroy their world. I just had to stop paying for it. I was enjoying the quiet solitude of my penthouse when the intercom buzzed, breaking the absolute silence of my morning. It was the head of building security. He sounded unusually tense and apologized profusely for the interruption. He told me a frantic white woman had slipped past the outer security gates by tailgating a delivery truck into the private loading dock. She was currently standing in our pristine marble lobby, and she was screaming my name at the top of her lungs. I knew exactly who it was before he even finished his sentence. My daughter-in-law, Khloe, had finally figured out where the real money lived. She had driven from the suburbs to the heart of Chicago to demand answers. I told security not to lay a single finger on her. I instructed them to stand back and observe because I would come down and handle the pest myself. I stepped onto the private elevator and let it carry me down to the ground floor. When the polished steel doors slid open, the sheer volume of her screeching echoed terribly off the high vaulted ceilings of the lobby. Khloe was a chaotic mess. Her blonde hair was completely disheveled and her face was flushed with frantic anger. She was still wearing the expensive designer mink coat I had indirectly paid for last winter. She was aggressively pointing her finger at the security guards, demanding they give her immediate access to my financial accounts. She kept screaming that I was a deceitful thief and that I had stolen her family money overnight. She claimed the $2 million suburban mansion was hers by right of marriage. She yelled that a lowly maintenance worker had no business holding the deed to her life and that I must have committed massive fraud. I walked out of the elevator with slow, deliberate steps. My hands were resting calmly in my pockets. I did not look angry or intimidated. I looked at her the way a person looks at a dirty stain on a clean sidewalk. She stopped yelling at the guards the second she saw me approaching. Her face contorted with a toxic mixture of desperate rage and sheer disbelief. She marched toward me, closing the distance between us. She demanded that I turn her luxury vehicles back on immediately. She ordered me to tear up the eviction notice and transfer the house into her name right there on the spot. She said she would never allow her precious children to be punished just because Vivien had decided to divorce me at the Christmas dinner. She was so blinded by her own lifelong entitlement that she actually believed she could march into my private building and give me direct orders. She honestly thought her demands still carried weight. I simply shook my head and looked her dead in the eyes. I told her the charity was permanently closed and that she had 30 days to pack her designer bags before the sheriffs threw them out on the lawn. Khloe realized very quickly that her loud demands were completely useless against my silence. The realization hit her hard that she had absolutely no leverage and no real power in this situation. So she resorted to the oldest and most dangerous weapon she had in her arsenal. She reached into her expensive purse and pulled out her smartphone. She looked me right in the eye and told me I was going to deeply regret disrespecting a woman of her social standing. She dialed 911. I stood perfectly still and watched her entirely fabricated performance unfold. As soon as the emergency dispatcher answered, her voice completely changed. The aggressive, angry screeching vanished in a split second. It was instantly replaced by breathless, hysterical sobbing. She cried into the phone receiver, claiming she was trapped in a building lobby and feared for her life. She told the operator that a dangerous, hostile black man was aggressively threatening her physically and trying to steal all of her family assets. She weaponized her tears with practiced perfection. She knew exactly what specific words to use to trigger a massive and immediate police response. She painted herself as the fragile, innocent victim who was cornered by a violent predator. She wanted the justice system to swoop in and crush the 75-year-old man standing quietly in front of her. She hung up the phone and wiped her fake tears away, revealing a vicious little smirk on her face. She stepped closer and whispered that I was going to be locked up in a cell today. She said she would easily take everything I owned while I rotted in prison because the police would always believe her over me. She thought the police badge was her personal customer service department. She expected them to arrive with weapons drawn and blindly take the word of a crying, wealthy-looking woman over a silent, older black man. It was a dangerous societal dynamic she was trying to exploit, and 50 years ago it might have worked perfectly. But she did not know that true wealth operates 10 steps ahead of blind panic. While she was busy throwing her theatrical tantrum and calling the authorities, I had already pressed a single button on my smartwatch. It was a direct emergency line to my corporate legal team. I did not need to raise my voice or shed a single fake tear. I just waited patiently for the inevitable collision between her suburban entitlement and my untouchable reality. Less than 5 minutes later, the heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open with incredible force. 3 police officers rushed inside. Their faces were tense and their hands were resting cautiously on their holsters. They scanned the room expecting a violent physical confrontation based on the panicked distress call they had received. Khloe immediately threw herself toward them, sobbing uncontrollably again and pointing a shaking finger directly at my chest. She begged them to arrest me on the spot, claiming I was a dangerous thief who had stolen her house and her cars and was keeping her hostage in the lobby. The officers stepped forward, fixing their firm, aggressive gazes on me. But before they could utter a single command or take another step, the private elevator chimed behind me. The doors parted, and Ms. Davis stepped into the lobby. Ms. Davis was my lead corporate attorney and one of the sharpest legal minds in Chicago. She was a formidable, brilliant African-American woman who commanded absolute respect the second she entered any room. She wore a flawless, tailored charcoal suit and carried a thick leather portfolio. She walked right past me and positioned herself directly between the police officers and Khloe. She spoke with a calm, chilling authority that instantly de-escalated the physical tension in the room. She formally introduced herself to the officers and handed the lead policeman her heavy embossed business card. She then opened her portfolio and presented the certified legal deeds to the suburban estate, as well as the corporate titles to both luxury vehicles. She patiently explained to the officers that every single asset in question was legally owned by Sterling Heritage Holdings, which was a private trust under my absolute control. She showed them the documented proof that Khloe was nothing more than a non-paying tenant who had just been served a lawful eviction notice that very morning. The officers carefully reviewed the watermarked legal documents with official state seals. The aggressive posture they had walked in with completely evaporated into thin air. They looked at the ironclad proof of my ownership and then turned their attention back to Khloe. Ms. Davis did not stop there. She informed the officers that the woman crying on the floor was currently committing criminal trespass on private commercial property after bypassing a security gate. She also politely reminded them that filing a false police report to weaponize law enforcement against an innocent property owner was a very serious criminal offense in the state of Illinois. The reality of the situation crashed down on the police officers. They realized they had been completely manipulated by a hysterical tenant throwing a fit over an eviction. The lead officer handed the documents back to Ms. Davis with a respectful nod and walked over to Khloe. The sympathy in his eyes was entirely gone, replaced by stern annoyance. He told her in a very firm voice that this was strictly a civil matter and she had absolutely no legal right to be on these premises. He ordered her to leave the building immediately or she would be walking out in handcuffs for trespassing and misusing the emergency dispatch system. Khloe stopped crying instantly. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Her ultimate weapon, the police force she thought she controlled, had failed her completely. They were not going to save her or give her the house. They were actively threatening to arrest her. She looked at me one last time, her face pale with absolute defeat and profound humiliation. She turned around and walked out into the freezing Chicago wind, escorted to the sidewalk by the very same officers she had tried to use to destroy me. The lobby returned to its peaceful silence, and I took the elevator back up to my penthouse to enjoy the rest of my coffee. While Khloe was marching out of my building in total humiliation, my 40-year-old son Andre was sitting on the freezing curb outside his heavily unmortgaged and soon-to-be vacant suburban mansion. The Chicago wind was howling, biting through his expensive designer jacket, but the real chill was coming from inside his chest. His fingers were shaking so violently from panic that he could barely unlock his phone screen. He had absolutely no money to his name. He had no cars in his driveway. He had a wife who was currently screaming at police officers in downtown Chicago and a 30-day eviction notice burning a hole in his pocket. He realized how utterly useless he was without my invisible hand guiding his life. With no one else left to turn to and his pride completely shattered, he dialed the one person he thought could save him from impending poverty. He called his mother. Vivien was lounging by a heated indoor pool at an elite luxury spa hotel miles away from the chaos. She was sipping cucumber water and waiting for her wealthy investor boyfriend to return from a supposed high-level business meeting. She felt incredibly smug and victorious. When her phone vibrated on the glass table, she expected it to be a congratulatory message from a country club friend about her bold divorce stunt at the Michelin-starred restaurant on Christmas Eve. Instead, when she answered the call, she heard the desperate, hyperventilating sobs of her grown son. Andre could barely string a coherent sentence together. He stammered and choked on his tears, telling his mother that they were completely ruined and about to be thrown out onto the street. Vivien, annoyed by the sudden interruption to her perfect spa day, told him to calm down and stop acting like a dramatic child. She asked him what on earth could possibly be wrong with his perfect, successful life. Andre took a ragged breath and confessed everything. He told her about the dead luxury cars in the driveway refusing to start. He told her about the frozen bank accounts showing negative balances and locked access screens. He told her about the man in the cheap brown suit who had handed him a formal legal eviction notice. Vivien laughed out loud at first. She told him that was absolutely impossible because she had personally overseen the family finances and knew his income was incredibly stable. Then Andre dropped the anvil on her reality. He told her that she did not know anything at all. He revealed that the mysterious corporate entity that owned his massive $2 million home and leased his luxury vehicles was called Sterling Heritage Holdings. And then he finally said the words that would change the trajectory of Vivien's entire greedy existence. He told her that the maintenance worker she had discarded like trash on Christmas Eve was actually the sole owner of that vast holding company. He told her that his father was a secret multimillionaire and that Leon had just cut the invisible cord that funded their entire fake suburban royalty lifestyle. At first, Vivien utterly refused to believe it. She sat straight up on her luxury lounge chair, gripping her phone so tightly her manicured knuckles turned bright white. She told Andre he was being ridiculous, and that his father was nothing more than a blue-collar loser who probably forgot to pay a simple utility bill. But Andre kept crying, explaining how the bank manager had confirmed the accounts were tied to a massive private wealth trust. He recounted how the restaurant manager had bowed deeply to his father and declared that Leon owned the very building they had eaten in. The pieces of the puzzle began to violently snap together inside Vivien's mind. The realization hit her like a runaway freight train. For 40 long years, she had lived with a man she believed was holding her back from a life of elite luxury. She had constantly berated him for his dirty work boots and his battered Ford truck. She had sought out the attention of other wealthy men just to feel a taste of the high society she felt she inherently deserved. And all along, she had been sleeping next to an absolute whale. She had been married to a quiet, untouchable titan of Chicago real estate. The sheer magnitude of the wealth she had blindly walked away from made her physically dizzy. But that dizziness did not turn into regret. It did not turn into remorse for how cruelly she had treated me or how she had allowed her father Harlon to disrespect me. It immediately transmuted into a dark, venomous, and all-consuming greed. She hung up the phone on her sobbing son without even offering him a single word of comfort or a temporary place to stay. Andre and his impending homelessness were instantly erased from her mind. The only thing Vivien cared about now was the massive payday she believed she was legally entitled to. She quickly gathered her expensive things, left the luxury spa, and completely ignored her new investor boyfriend. She had a brand new mission. She spent the entire afternoon interviewing the most ruthless predatory divorce attorneys in the state of Illinois. She was not looking for a fair, amicable settlement. She was looking for a legal mercenary who would drain my blood and hand her my empire on a silver platter. By early evening, she had hired a man famous for destroying wealthy husbands in high-profile, brutal divorces. He was a sleazy, aggressive lawyer who promised Vivien that under state marital laws, a 40-year marriage guaranteed her exactly 50% of every single asset hidden inside my trust. They sat in his high-rise office for hours drafting a brutal legal assault designed to freeze my companies, seize my bank accounts, and force me to hand over half of everything I had spent a lifetime protecting. Vivien smiled a wicked, predatory smile, absolutely convinced that she had just won the ultimate lottery and that I was about to pay for making her live a humble life. 2 days later, the perfect silence of my penthouse was interrupted by a sharp, authoritative knock on my heavy oak front door. I was sitting by the floor-to-ceiling windows reading a detailed financial report and enjoying a warm cup of herbal tea. I walked over to the door and opened it calmly. A man in a sharp suit handed me a thick, heavy stack of legal documents bound by a thick rubber band. He announced loudly that I had been officially served and quickly stepped back into the private elevator to make his escape. I carried the heavy stack of papers to my mahogany desk and spread them out under the reading light. It was a massive legal subpoena and a formal petition for asset division filed by Vivien's new aggressive legal bulldog. The documents were filled with hostile demands and aggressive, baseless accusations. They accused me of deep financial infidelity, of hiding massive marital assets, and of deliberately deceiving my spouse for 4 long decades to deprive her of a luxurious lifestyle. The sleazy lawyer demanded an immediate emergency injunction to freeze all financial operations of Sterling Heritage Holdings. He demanded full transparent access to every bank account, property, deed, and investment portfolio tied to my name or my company's. He wanted forensic accountants to tear through my life and expose every single dollar I had ever earned. And at the very end of the document, in bold, arrogant lettering, Vivien demanded exactly 50% of my entire net worth, along with permanent, exorbitant alimony to maintain the standard of living she claimed she had been illegally deprived of all these years. The threats were explicitly clear and incredibly arrogant. They fully intended to drag me through a humiliating public trial to expose my private empire to the media and to bleed me dry in legal fees until I surrendered half of my kingdom just to make the headache go away. They thought they had cornered a scared old man who would rather pay up than face a brutal courtroom battle. An ordinary man might have panicked reading those aggressive threats. An ordinary man might have called his ex-wife to beg for a quiet, private settlement to avoid the total destruction of his life work. But I was not an ordinary man, and I certainly was not intimidated by a desperate, greedy woman and a flashy lawyer waving pieces of paper. I did not feel a single ounce of fear or anxiety. I did not feel my heart rate increase or my palms sweat. I felt a deep, profound sense of pity for their utter ignorance and their blind arrogance. I calmly reached for my cell phone and dialed the direct private number to Ms. Davis, my brilliant lead corporate attorney. When she answered, I told her that Vivien had taken the bait perfectly and filed a massive lawsuit for half of the holding company. Ms. Davis let out a soft, knowing chuckle on the other end of the line. She knew exactly what was coming next. I did not ask her to try and negotiate a smaller payout. I did not ask her to prepare a desperate defense or to hide any money in offshore accounts. I simply looked out at the freezing, beautiful Chicago skyline, took a slow sip of my herbal tea, and gave her the only instruction necessary to completely obliterate Vivien's greedy crusade. I told Ms. Davis to gather our entire forensic accounting team and to open the 1969 files. The trap was perfectly set, and Vivien was walking blindly right into the jaws of a legal guillotine she could not possibly comprehend. Harlon was 92 years old, but his hatred burned with the dark energy of a much younger man. He could not stomach the reality of his current situation. A black maintenance worker, a man he had openly mocked and belittled for 4 entire decades, had completely outsmarted him and stripped his family of their unearned luxury. Harlon had built a moderately successful logistics company back in his prime and had spent his entire life looking down on people who did not look like him or belong to his exclusive circles. Now his grandson Andre was facing a brutal eviction, and his daughter Vivien was scrambling for cash to pay her aggressive divorce attorney. Harlon absolutely refused to accept this defeat. He decided to strike back using the only weapon he understood perfectly, which was his social privilege and his elite country club connections. Harlon drove his heavy Cadillac to his private country club in the affluent northern suburbs of Chicago. He sat in the mahogany-lined cigar lounge with his wealthy aging friends and spun a completely fabricated narrative. He painted himself and his daughter Vivien as the innocent victims of a massive and highly illegal financial con. Harlon reached out to a shady public relations fixer who specialized in dirty digital campaigns and character assassination. Together they began planting fake stories on local Chicago business blogs and social media platforms. The articles they published were vicious and entirely baseless. They claimed that I was a fraudulent embezzler who had spent 40 years stealing money from my own family. Harlon fed the desperate bloggers a fictional narrative that Vivien was actually a brilliant investor who had built a massive real estate fortune, and that I had somehow manipulated complex banking loopholes to lock her out of her own hard-earned money. They called me a scam artist masquerading as a humble blue-collar worker. They boldly published my full name and the name of my holding company across the internet. They tried to frame me as a dangerous predator who was financially abusing his elderly wife and stealing his own son's trust fund. Harlon honestly believed that if he humiliated me publicly, I would simply cower in fear. He thought a loud public smear campaign would force me to the negotiating table to protect my business reputation. He expected me to panic and hand over a massive financial settlement just to make the digital noise go away. While the fake articles circulated online and the racist gossip spread through Harlon's country club, I remained completely undisturbed inside my penthouse. I did not issue a public statement to the press. I did not hire a crisis management team to defend my character or my legacy. I simply sat by my floor-to-ceiling windows, drinking black coffee, watching the winter snow melt over the city, and let them scream their lies into the digital void. My lead corporate attorney, Ms. Davis, was not nearly as relaxed as I was. She called my private line absolutely furious about the libelous articles popping up on her feed. She told me we had more than enough concrete evidence to file a massive defamation lawsuit against Harlon and the bloggers he had hired. She wanted to crush them in civil court and force them to print embarrassing public retractions. She had a team of aggressive litigators standing by, ready to bankrupt Harlon for his deliberate slander. I calmly told Ms. Davis to stand down and hold her fire. I told her to let them keep typing and let them keep publishing. I explained my philosophy to her very clearly over the phone. When your enemy is busy digging their own grave, you do not snatch the shovel out of their hands. You simply offer them a bigger shovel. Every fake article Harlon funded and every malicious post Vivien shared was leaving a permanent digital footprint of their toxic intent. They were building a heavily documented trail of slander that we would eventually use to destroy them completely when the time was right. I knew my empire was entirely bulletproof. My commercial tenants did not care about suburban country club gossip. They paid their heavy rent checks to an invisible trust every single month without fail. My investment portfolios were managed by emotionless algorithms and elite bankers who only cared about profit margins, not fake family drama. Harlon's smear campaign was nothing more than the desperate thrashing of a drowning man trying to pull me under. I watched them waste their dwindling financial resources paying dirty bloggers to attack my name. I enjoyed the peaceful silence of my secure home while they exhausted themselves fighting a ghost. I knew their digital tantrum was just a noisy distraction from their real problem. They were running out of time and they were running out of money very fast. The smear campaign failed to produce a single dollar for Vivien or her father. I did not call them to beg for mercy. I did not offer a settlement to quiet the blogs. I simply let them rot in the deafening silence of my indifference. This absolute lack of reaction sent Vivien into a panicked frenzy. Her sleazy divorce attorney had finally done his actual job and dug deeply into the legal structure of Sterling Heritage Holdings. He hit an absolute brick wall. He realized that my assets were locked tight behind impenetrable layers of corporate shields and owned by a trust established by my uncle in 1969. The lawyer had to sit Vivien down in his office and deliver the crushing news. The money was completely untouchable under standard marital divorce laws. He explained that since the trust existed long before their marriage and was structured exclusively for my direct bloodline, a divorce judge could not legally give her a single penny of the principal assets. Vivien was furious and terrified. She demanded an immediate solution. She desperately needed that money to maintain her arrogant facade and to fund her new, wealthy lifestyle. Her lawyer, realizing he might not get his massive contingency fee, decided to cross a very dark and highly illegal ethical line. He suggested a dirty and malicious escalation to bypass the financial protections of the trust. If they could not take the money through a standard divorce proceeding, they would have to take control of the man who controlled the money. The sleazy lawyer proposed a terrifying strategy. He told Vivien and Harlon that they needed to file an emergency petition for medical conservatorship. They were going to claim to the state that I was suffering from severe dementia and rapid cognitive decline. They planned to tell a judge that my sudden decision to cut off my loving family and hoard my wealth was a clear medical symptom of paranoid delusions caused by an aging, failing brain. Vivien loved the idea immediately. It was the perfect cruel revenge. She would not just take my money, she would take my autonomy, my freedom, and my voice. She wanted to strip away my driver license, my ability to sign legal contracts, and my right to live independently in my own home. I received the tip about their new legal strategy from a sharp paralegal who owed Ms. Davis a massive favor. When Ms. Davis called to tell me their upcoming plan, her voice was thick with absolute disgust. She explained that Vivien was going to use the fake online articles Harlon had planted as documented proof of my erratic and abusive behavior. They were going to argue in court that a sane, loving father would never leave his son homeless and that my mind was clearly failing me. They wanted a judge to declare me mentally unfit, strip me of my human rights, and appoint Vivien as the sole legal guardian of my massive estate. It was the ultimate betrayal. My ex-wife and my son were actively weaponizing the legal and medical systems to erase my humanity just so they could get their greedy hands on my bank accounts. They wanted to throw me into a locked, state-run facility while they moved into my penthouse and drained my uncle's legacy. The sheer evil of their plan was staggering, but I remained completely unfazed. They thought they had found a clever loophole to steal my life, but they had absolutely no idea that I was already 10 steps ahead of their dirty little game, and I was preparing to drop a legal guillotine right on their necks. Vivien and Khloe were growing increasingly desperate as their financial reality crumbled around them. The sleazy lawyer they hired had convinced them that their only path to my wealth was a medical conservatorship. But to get a judge to strip away my human rights, they needed hard evidence of my supposed cognitive decline. They needed a video of me acting confused, aggressive, or entirely detached from reality. Since I was perfectly sane, they had to manufacture the evidence themselves. Khloe maxed out one of her last remaining credit cards to hire a shady pay to play psychiatrist from the darker corners of the city. He was a corrupt doctor, known for signing off on bogus worker compensation claims and writing questionable prescriptions for a heavy cash fee. His job was simple. He was going to approach me in public, ask deliberately confusing and patronizing questions, and provoke me into an angry outburst. Khloe and Vivien would be standing a few feet away, secretly recording the entire interaction on their smartphones to present to the judge as proof of my dangerous dementia. They had spent days tracking my movements to figure out my morning routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I visited a quiet, upscale coffee shop in the Gold Coast neighborhood. I liked to sit at a corner table by the window, reading the Financial Times and enjoying a dark roast before heading to my corporate office. It was a peaceful ritual I had maintained for years. Vivien knew this routine well. She knew I valued my peace and quiet in public. She calculated that a sudden, loud confrontation would catch me off guard and embarrass me into lashing out. They drove into the city early that Thursday morning, parking their rented sedan a block away. They walked up to the cafe, hiding behind large sunglasses and thick winter coats. I saw them through the glass before they even crossed the street. A man who has spent 40 years observing the world from the background learns to notice every single detail. I saw Khloe holding her phone awkwardly at chest level, the red recording light blinking softly. I saw Vivien pointing me out to the sleazy doctor who straightened his cheap suit and walked into the cafe with an arrogant smirk on his face. I did not move a muscle. I slowly folded my newspaper and took a calm sip of my coffee. The doctor marched right up to my table, blocking my view of the window. He did not introduce himself professionally. Instead, he leaned in close and spoke to me in that slow, loud, exaggerated tone people use when they assume they are speaking to a deaf or senile person. He asked me if I knew what year it was. He asked me if I was lost and needed help finding my way back to my family. He said my wife Vivien was outside and was terribly worried about my failing memory. He reached out and tried to place his hand on my shoulder, a deliberate physical invasion meant to trigger a defensive reaction. He wanted me to swat his hand away. He wanted me to stand up and shout so Khloe could capture the angry black man stereotype perfectly on camera. They wanted a chaotic scene they could show to a white judge to prove I was a danger to myself and others. They vastly underestimated my absolute self-control. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I calmly set my coffee cup down on the saucer and looked right past the fraudulent doctor. I locked eyes directly with Khloe's camera lens across the room. I spoke with chilling legal precision, projecting my voice just enough so the microphone would pick up every single syllable flawlessly. I stated my full legal name, Leon Sterling. I stated the exact date, the exact time down to the minute, and the exact street address of the coffee shop we were currently sitting in. I then turned my gaze to the corrupt doctor. I addressed him by his full medical license name, having already recognized him from a background check my security team ran on known medical fraudsters in the area. I politely informed him that under the state laws of Illinois, approaching a private citizen under false medical pretenses to aid in the fraudulent seizure of financial assets constitutes a severe felony. I told him that I was fully aware he was being paid by my estranged wife and my daughter-in-law to manufacture a fake psychological evaluation. I looked back at Khloe's recording phone and smiled a very small, very cold smile. I then recited the exact dollar amount currently held in my primary checking account down to the last cent just to prove my total financial lucidity. I told the doctor that my corporate attorney, Ms. Davis, already had a drafted complaint ready to send to the state medical board regarding his history of accepting bribes for fake diagnoses. I suggested that if he valued his medical license and his freedom, he would turn around and walk out of the cafe before I called the police to report his harassment. The blood drained completely from the doctor's face. He realized in a fraction of a second that he had walked into a massive legal bear trap. He was expecting a confused elderly maintenance worker. He found himself face to face with an untouchable billionaire who knew his name, his history, and the exact penal codes to destroy his life. The doctor did not even look back at Vivien and Khloe. He turned on his heel and practically ran out of the coffee shop, pushing past the heavy glass doors and sprinting down the icy sidewalk. Vivien and Khloe stood frozen near the pastry counter. Their entire ambush had just spectacularly imploded. Not only had I completely destroyed their narrative of dementia, but they had just recorded me dismantling a medical fraud scheme with terrifying mental clarity. That video was utterly useless to their sleazy divorce lawyer. If they ever showed that footage to a judge, it would instantly prove that they were the ones committing a crime. I picked up my coffee cup, raised it slightly in their direction as a silent toast, and went back to reading my newspaper. Khloe lowered her phone, her hands shaking violently. Vivien looked like she was about to be physically sick. They turned around and hurried out into the freezing wind, their master plan reduced to absolute ashes. I knew that humiliating them in the coffee shop was a satisfying personal victory, but it was not a permanent legal shield. Vivien and her lawyer were desperate, and desperate people do not stop just because they fail once. They would undoubtedly go to court and claim I was refusing medical evaluations because I had something to hide. They would twist my calm demeanor into a sign of sociopathic detachment. I needed to build an impenetrable fortress around my cognitive status before we ever set foot inside a courtroom. I paid for my coffee, left a generous tip, and walked directly to my waiting town car. I called Ms. Davis from the back seat. I told her about the ambush and instructed her to execute our counter-medical protocol immediately. We were not going to wait for a judge to order a psychological evaluation. We were going to provide one so overwhelming and undeniably pristine that no lawyer on earth could ever question my sanity again. Ms. Davis had already coordinated the entire process. She directed my driver to the most prestigious private medical research facility in the state of Illinois. This was not a standard clinic. It was a premier neurological institute where elite executives and top-tier politicians went for cognitive vetting. When I arrived, I was greeted by a panel of 3 highly respected board-certified neurologists. They were not doctors you could bribe with a maxed-out credit card. They were leading experts in their field. I voluntarily subjected myself to a grueling 4-hour comprehensive cognitive and psychological evaluation. They did not just ask me what year it was. They ran me through a brutal gauntlet of mental stress tests. They tested my short-term and long-term memory recall. They administered complex spatial reasoning puzzles, logic sequencing, and advanced mathematical problem-solving under timed pressure. They evaluated my emotional regulation, my speech patterns, and my executive functioning skills. I sat in that quiet clinical room and answered every single question with absolute focus. I recalled complex strings of numbers, I solved the logic puzzles flawlessly, and I articulated my personal and financial history with crystal clear precision. The doctors were thoroughly impressed. At the end of the 4-hour session, the lead neurologist sat across from me and smiled. He told me that my cognitive functions were not just normal for a man of 75 years old. They were functioning at the level of a healthy man decades younger. My mental acuity was ranked in the highest possible percentile. By the end of the day, I walked out of that facility holding a thick sealed envelope. Inside were 3 separate sworn and notarized affidavits from the top neurological experts in the state. They definitively certified that I was in perfect mental health, possessing total and complete capacity to manage my vast financial empire and make my own legal decisions. The documents were stamped, signed, and legally bulletproof. I handed the envelope to Ms. Davis, who was waiting for me in the lobby. She tapped the folder against her briefcase and smiled a sharp, victorious smile. We had completely neutralized Vivien's most dangerous weapon before she could even bring it into the courtroom. When the trial date finally arrived, they were going to walk in expecting to easily conquer a confused, helpless old man. Instead, they were going to collide head-first with a legal juggernaut backed by undeniable medical science and bottomless financial resources. My armor was fully secured. The trap was set. It was time to let them step into the courtroom and watch their entire greedy world burn to the ground. The morning of the trial was bitterly cold, even by Chicago standards. The freezing wind whipped through the downtown streets, cutting through the heavy winter coats of the people walking past. I stepped out of my town car and looked up at the massive stone pillars of the county courthouse. I wore a simple, well-tailored navy blue suit and a calm expression. Ms. Davis walked beside me carrying a single, sleek leather briefcase that held the absolute destruction of my former family. We entered the heavy wooden doors, bypassed the loud crowds in the hallways, and took our seats in the quiet courtroom. I sat with my hands folded, resting on the polished oak table, feeling nothing but a profound sense of peace. I was not a man facing the loss of his empire. I was a man waiting for the curtain to drop on a very bad play. 15 minutes later, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud thud. Vivien made her grand entrance, and she made sure everyone in the gallery noticed her. She did not look like a heartbroken wife seeking justice or a concerned spouse worried about her ailing husband. She looked like a wealthy socialite stepping onto a red carpet at an exclusive charity gala. She wore a tailored crimson dress suit that screamed expensive, accompanied by a fresh salon blowout and heavy pearl jewelry wrapping around her neck. She walked down the center aisle with her chin held high, a smug, victorious smile plastered across her face. Right behind her was her father, Harlon. He was leaning heavily on a polished wooden cane, but his 92-year-old eyes were practically glowing with greedy anticipation. He glared at me across the aisle, a look of pure, arrogant contempt flashing across his wrinkled face. He whispered something to Vivien, and they both let out a quiet, condescending laugh. Andre and Khloe followed closely behind them, completing the procession of the entitled. Despite being completely broke and facing an impending eviction, Khloe had managed to dress herself in designer labels from head to toe. She probably used whatever remaining credit she had left to maintain her ridiculous facade of suburban royalty. She held her head up with that familiar, unearned confidence, playing the role of the innocent, traumatized daughter-in-law perfectly. Andre, however, kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, entirely avoiding my gaze. He wore an expensive suit, but his posture was that of a coward. He stood tall behind his mother's aggressive legal team, but he looked fragile, as if a strong wind could knock him over. They took their seats on the plaintiff's side, whispering to each other and letting out soft, confident chuckles. They honestly believed this trial was merely a formality. They thought they were going to walk out of this building with the keys to my entire financial empire. They looked at me as if I were already a defeated man, completely unaware that they were sitting directly on top of a live legal landmine. The bailiff called the room to order and announced the arrival of the judge. Everyone rose to their feet as Judge Miller took his seat at the high bench. He was a stern, no-nonsense man with graying hair and decades of experience handling complex family and financial disputes. He looked over his reading glasses at the packed tables, organized his papers, and nodded for the proceedings to begin. Vivien's highly paid divorce attorney practically leaped out of his chair. He buttoned his expensive, flashy suit jacket and walked to the center of the floor, putting on a deeply theatrical and dramatic performance for the court. He began his opening argument by painting me as a mastermind of deception. He pointed a dramatic, accusatory finger in my direction and told the judge that for 40 long years I had lived a dark, sinister double life. He claimed I had systematically and maliciously deceived my devoted, trusting wife, hiding billions of dollars in a secret trust fund while forcing her to live on a modest blue-collar budget. He called it the ultimate financial betrayal and a crime of marital neglect. He spoke about Vivien as if she were a long-suffering saint who had stood by a humble janitor only to be cruelly cast aside and left with nothing when she finally discovered the truth about his massive hidden wealth. But then his tone shifted dramatically. His loud, aggressive voice dropped to a soft, sorrowful whisper. He paced slowly in front of the judge's bench, playing the role of a deeply concerned advocate. He told the judge that while my financial deception was unforgivable, the real tragedy of this case was my current state of mind. He shook his head sadly and pulled a crisp white document from his thick manila folder. He announced to the court that it was a preliminary medical report from a licensed specialized psychiatrist. He read excerpts from the fraudulent document out loud, letting the lies echo across the silent courtroom. He read that I was suffering from severe cognitive decline, paranoid delusions, and aggressive behavioral outbursts. He argued passionately that my recent actions were not the choices of a sane or rational man. He claimed that suddenly cutting off my loving son, stopping his financial support, disabling his vehicles, and serving him with a cruel eviction notice were the clear, tragic symptoms of advanced aggressive dementia. He looked up at the judge with fake, pleading eyes and formally requested that Vivien be immediately appointed as my permanent legal conservator. He argued that it was the only way to protect my massive estate from my own failing mind and to ensure that my wealth was safely, responsibly managed by my caring, loving family. Sitting at her table, Vivien dabbed her dry eyes with a silk tissue, playing the role of the grieving wife trying to save her sick husband. Harlon nodded along in agreement, leaning on his cane. Khloe looked down, pretending to wipe away a tear. They thought their performance was absolutely flawless. Judge Miller looked down at the preliminary medical report placed on his bench and then turned his sharp gaze toward our table. He asked Ms. Davis if the defense had any response to these extremely serious medical allegations. Ms. Davis stood up slowly, adjusting the cuffs of her immaculate charcoal suit. She did not put on a loud theatrical show. She did not raise her voice, pace the floor, or point any fingers. She simply opened her sleek leather briefcase and extracted a small stack of impeccably organized documents. She walked up to the bench with the cold surgical precision of a legal executioner. She spoke in a calm, chillingly authoritative voice that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. She told the judge that we did not just have a simple response to the medical allegations, but we had concrete, irrefutable evidence of a severe criminal conspiracy occurring right inside his courtroom. She handed Judge Miller the first set of documents. They were the 3 sealed, notarized affidavits from the top neurological institute in the state of Illinois, perfectly certifying my flawless mental capacity. She explained clearly that I had voluntarily undergone a grueling 4-hour cognitive evaluation by 3 independent board-certified experts whose credentials completely dwarfed the plaintiff's questionable doctor. The judge read the affidavits, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the prestigious names signed at the bottom of the pages. But Ms. Davis was not finished. She turned her body slightly to face Vivien's table, locking eyes with the sleazy divorce attorney. She pulled out a second piece of paper and handed it directly to the judge. She announced that it was a subpoenaed financial record belonging to Khloe. She read the transaction history aloud, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. She detailed a $10,000 cash advance taken from Khloe's recently maxed-out credit card. She then traced that exact $10,000 through a direct wire transfer straight into a dummy shell corporation entirely owned by the very same psychiatrist who had written Vivien's fake medical report. The transfer was dated exactly 3 days before my supposed ambush evaluation took place. Ms. Davis stated loudly and clearly that the plaintiff had not provided a valid medical assessment to this court. They had provided a purchased bribe to fraudulently strip a sane man of his human rights and steal his private trust fund. The atmosphere in this courtroom violently shifted. The smug, victorious smiles vanished instantly from the faces of my former family, replaced by sheer naked panic. Khloe gasped out loud, covering her mouth with her trembling hands as she realized her financial footprint had just been exposed. Vivien's sleazy lawyer physically stepped back from the podium, his face draining of all color as he realized his clients had just handed him a fabricated document that could cost him his law license and send him to prison. Judge Miller slammed his hand down on the heavy wooden bench, his face turned thunderous. The veins in his neck visibly bulged as he stared directly at Vivien and her lawyer with absolute unbridled fury. He demanded to know if they had just attempted to submit bribed, fraudulent medical testimony into his court. The entire room fell into a deathly, terrifying silence. Andre shrank down into his chair, wishing he could disappear. Harlon stared with wide, shocked eyes, his arrogant smirk completely wiped away. The trap had officially snapped shut, closing its steel jaws around them, and there was absolutely no way out for any of them. Judge Miller was practically vibrating with pure, unadulterated rage. He tossed the fraudulent medical report aside as if it were contaminated waste. Vivien's sleazy lawyer was sweating profusely. His expensive custom suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big as he stammered and frantically flipped through his disorganized legal notes. He knew with absolute certainty that he was inches away from being completely disbarred and facing severe criminal charges for attempting to submit bribed medical testimony into a court of law. In a desperate act of self-preservation, he immediately threw Khloe directly under the bus. He stated for the official record that he had absolutely no prior knowledge of how his clients procured the medical evaluation, and he formally withdrew the conservatorship petition right there on the spot. He literally backed away from the podium, holding his hands up in a gesture of total surrender. But he was a financial mercenary who still wanted his massive contingency fee. He took a very deep breath, wiped his dripping forehead with a silk handkerchief, and desperately pivoted to his secondary line of attack. If they could not steal my freedom by declaring me insane, they were going to try to steal my bank accounts through sheer brute force marital law. He cleared his throat and addressed the judge again, his voice shaking only slightly at first, before gaining a false sense of confidence. He argued passionately that the medical issue was merely a distraction from the core financial reality of the case. He stated that Vivien had been my loyal, devoted wife for 40 long years. He claimed she had meticulously managed our household, raised our only son, and quietly supported my demanding career as a maintenance worker. The lawyer argued that under Illinois state law, any and all wealth held by either spouse during a 40-year union must absolutely be considered shared marital property. He pointed a dramatic, trembling finger at me and accused me of running a vast shadow empire behind my wife's back. He said I had maliciously hoarded billions of dollars in commercial real estate and hidden cash assets while forcing my devoted spouse to clip grocery coupons and live like a complete pauper. He demanded that the court immediately slice my entire holding company in half and award Vivien 50% of everything I owned, plus massive compensatory alimony. He shouted that fairness and the law demanded she be heavily compensated for 4 decades of severe financial deprivation and emotional distress. Vivien sat up a little straighter in her heavy wooden chair. The color slowly returned to her pale face. She looked at her aggressive lawyer with renewed hope and a sickening sense of entitlement. Harlon nodded vigorously, leaning heavily on his polished cane. He was fully convinced that the white-collar legal system would naturally favor them over a retired black maintenance worker, regardless of the facts. They truly thought that even if they lost the dementia angle, they still had the unbreakable iron shield of marital asset division to protect their greed. They honestly thought I was just a lucky man who made some good real estate investments during our long marriage, and that they were automatically entitled to a massive payday just for sticking around and tolerating my presence. They sat there dreaming about how they were going to spend my money. Ms. Davis did not even flinch at the lawyer's loud, passionate speech. She stood perfectly still at our defense table, perfectly composed with a slight knowing smile playing on her lips. She waited patiently until the courtroom was completely silent before she addressed the judge. She told Judge Miller that opposing counsel was fundamentally misunderstanding the basic legal structure of generational wealth. She unlatched her sleek briefcase and carefully pulled out a very old, extremely fragile document. The thick paper was heavily yellowed with age, the edges worn and soft from decades of careful preservation. It was not a modern digital printout or a recently drafted corporate contract. It was a tangible piece of history. She walked the fragile document up to the judge's bench, holding it with the utmost respect. She explained clearly that the opposing counsel was operating under the completely false assumption that I had built this massive wealth during my marriage to Vivien. She stated for the official record that not a single dollar of my real estate empire was ever generated from marital funds. Not one penny of my blue-collar maintenance worker salary was ever commingled with the corporate trust accounts. She then told the court the true powerful story of Sterling Heritage Holdings. She explained that my late uncle was one of the very few successful black real estate pioneers in Chicago during the 1960s. He built his logistics and property business from the ground up, fighting every single day through systemic redlining, corrupt banks denying him basic business loans, and impossible racial odds. Because he knew exactly how ruthless and predatory the world could be, he wanted to ensure his hard-earned legacy would never be stolen, diluted, or squandered by greedy outsiders. In 1969, 10 full years before I even met Vivien, my uncle established an impenetrable generation-skipping trust fund. When I turned 18, he legally transferred the entirety of his commercial empire into that ironclad trust, naming me as the sole primary beneficiary and executor of the estate. Ms. Davis pointed specifically to the faded signatures on the yellowed paper. She explained that the trust was written with extreme bloodline protections drafted by the best legal minds my uncle could afford at the time. It was legally structured so that the principal assets could never ever be considered community property, regardless of any future marriage I might enter into. She told the judge that Vivien was not entitled to half of the trust because Vivien never contributed a single dime to it, she never managed it, and technically she never even knew it existed until exactly 3 weeks ago at a Christmas dinner. My small maintenance worker salary was the only actual marital asset we shared, and I had generously allowed Vivien to control every cent of that modest income for 40 years while she paraded around pretending to be an investment genius. The empire, however, was a completely separate legal entity entirely out of her desperate reach. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the soft mechanical hum of the heating vents above us. The sleazy divorce attorney stared at Ms. Davis with his mouth hanging wide open. He had lazily assumed I was a lottery winner or a lucky stock trader who struck it rich while legally married. He had never bothered to do the deep historical forensic research required to understand the true origin of my immense wealth. He had no idea he was fighting a 50-year-old fortress of legal protection built by a brilliant man who knew exactly how to secure his family legacy against people exactly like Vivien and Harlon. Judge Miller spent several long, agonizing minutes reading the original 1969 trust documents. The silence stretched on suffocating the plaintiff's table. He meticulously examined the official seals, the faded signatures, and the specific exclusionary marital clauses Ms. Davis had clearly highlighted for his review. He then looked over the massive stack of forensic financial audits, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that marital funds and trust funds had remained strictly and legally segregated for 4 entire decades. He stacked the papers neatly, aligned the edges perfectly, and looked down at Vivien and her crumbling legal team. The judge spoke with a booming, authoritative voice that left absolutely no room for debate or appeal. He stated that the legal precedent in this specific matter was incredibly clear and historically rock solid. The trust was established long prior to the marriage, and its assets were completely and forever protected from any form of marital division. He looked directly at Vivien and told her that she had no legal claim, no equitable claim, and no moral claim to a single dollar inside Sterling Heritage Holdings. He ruled that the trust was entirely exempt from the divorce settlement. Vivien was getting absolutely zero from the empire she thought she had conquered. But Judge Miller was not finished destroying their arrogant world. He turned his harsh attention back to the fraudulent medical documents they had attempted to submit just an hour earlier. He stated fiercely that his court does not take kindly to malicious, desperate attempts to weaponize the medical system for personal financial gain. He told Vivien and Khloe that their behavior was egregious, predatory, and highly illegal. Because they had deliberately filed a frivolous and completely fraudulent claim attempting to strip a sane man of his civil liberties, the judge brought down the heavy legal hammer. He officially ordered Vivien to be fully responsible for 100% of my legal fees. He mandated that she pay the astronomical costs of retaining Ms. Davis and my entire elite team of forensic accountants. He then turned his glare to her lawyer and warned him that he was personally forwarding the details of the $10,000 medical bribe to the State Bar Association for immediate disciplinary review and potential criminal prosecution. The reality of the completely disastrous verdict hit Vivien all at once. The crushing weight of her own arrogance finally broke her. She was not just walking away from this marriage with absolutely nothing. She was walking away with a massive, suffocating mountain of legal debt that would haunt her for the rest of her miserable life. The billionaire she had mocked and degraded for 40 years was legally untouchable, and the direct consequences of her blinding greed had just permanently bankrupted her. Vivien let out a strangled, breathless gasp. Her weak knees buckled completely, and she physically collapsed into her heavy leather courtroom chair, clutching her chest as she sobbed uncontrollably. Harlon dropped his polished cane, watching the wooden stick clatter loudly against the hard tile floor, his face pale and slack with total shock. Andre put his head between his knees, looking absolutely destroyed and utterly pathetic. Khloe stared blankly at the wood-paneled wall, realizing her wealthy lifestyle was permanently dead and buried. I simply stood up, buttoned my tailored navy suit jacket, and walked out of the courtroom with my head held high, leaving them buried forever under the massive rubble of their own spectacular failure. The morning air in the wealthy suburbs was crisp and silent until the heavy diesel engines of 2 massive flatbed tow trucks shattered the peace. Andre stood in the window of the $2 million mansion he no longer owned. He watched through the glass as men in heavy work jackets walked up his pristine driveway. They did not knock on the door. They did not ask for permission. They simply attached heavy steel chains to the front axle of his silver Porsche and the rear chassis of Khloe's white Range Rover. The luxury vehicles had been remotely disabled for days, sitting in the driveway like very expensive paperweights. Andre opened the front door and ran out into the freezing cold, wearing only a thin sweater and pajama pants. He shouted at the men, waving his arms and demanding they stop touching his property. The lead driver, a burly man with a clipboard, did not even flinch. He handed Andre a piece of paper displaying the corporate repossession order authorized by Sterling Heritage Holdings. Andre read the name of my company, and the last remaining shred of his false pride completely vanished. The neighbors, the same wealthy doctors and executives Andre and Khloe had spent years trying to impress, stepped out onto their porches. They watched in absolute silence as the physical symbols of Andre's fake success were dragged up onto the flatbeds and driven away down the pristine suburban street. Andre was left standing alone in the freezing wind, shivering uncontrollably, realizing he was trapped in a sprawling empty mansion with no cars, no money, and an eviction date rapidly approaching. 2 days later, I was stepping out of my favorite downtown restaurant after enjoying a quiet lunch. The bitter Chicago wind whipped around the tall buildings. As I walked toward my waiting town car, a frantic figure broke through the crowd of pedestrians on the sidewalk. It was Andre. He looked absolutely pathetic. He was wearing the same expensive designer coat he wore to the courtroom, but it was heavily wrinkled, and he had clearly not shaved in days. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hands were shaking as he rushed toward me. He ignored my security driver, who stepped forward to intercept him. Andre fell to his knees right there on the busy, icy sidewalk. People walking by stopped and stared, but Andre did not care about his public image anymore. He grabbed the sleeve of my overcoat and began to sob uncontrollably. The tears streamed down his face as he begged me to listen to him. He pleaded for just one more chance. He started talking frantically, trying to shift every ounce of blame away from himself. He cried that it was Vivien who manipulated the family dynamics. He swore that it was Khloe who forced him to demand the luxury cars and the massive house. He claimed he was just a victim caught in the middle of their greedy, toxic behavior. He said he loved me, and that he was so incredibly sorry for letting them disrespect me at the Christmas dinner. He begged me to turn his bank accounts back on just enough so he could buy food and find a cheap apartment before the eviction. I looked down at my 40-year-old son and felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity in my heart. There was no residual paternal instinct to reach down and pull him up from the concrete. I gently but firmly pulled my arm away from his desperate grip. I looked him dead in the eyes, and my voice was as cold as the winter air surrounding us. I told him that for his entire adult life, I had given him absolutely everything. I had secretly funded his entire existence so he could walk through the world with his head held high. I bought his debts, and I bought his lifestyle. But when the ultimate test came, when his mother and his wife sat at that Michelin-starred restaurant and publicly stripped away my human dignity, he did nothing. I reminded him that he stared at his mashed potatoes in total silence while his racist grandfather told me I belonged under a bridge. I told Andre that a real man stands up for the people who sacrifice for him. I told him he was not a victim of Vivien or Khloe. I told him he was a coward who traded his own father for the comfort of a wealthy facade. And in the real world, cowards do not get bailouts. I told him to stand up, act like a man, and figure out how to survive on his own for the very first time in his life. I turned my back on him, got into the warm back seat of my car, and told my driver to pull away, leaving Andre sobbing on the freezing sidewalk. Andre had to walk nearly 3 miles to the nearest train station and take public transit all the way back to his empty suburban mansion. When he finally walked through the heavy oak front doors, shivering and utterly defeated, he found the house in total chaos. Khloe was in the master bedroom, frantically throwing her designer shoes, expensive jewelry, and silk dresses into 3 massive suitcases. The illusion of their happy, wealthy marriage had completely evaporated the exact second the tow trucks took away her Range Rover. Andre stood in the doorway and asked her what she was doing. Khloe did not even pause her packing. She spun around and unleashed a torrent of vicious, screaming hatred that echoed through the empty marble hallways. She told Andre he was a pathetic, broke loser. She revealed with absolutely zero remorse that the only reason she had ever married him was because Vivien had bragged about a massive hidden family fortune. Khloe admitted she thought Andre was a secret trust fund baby who would provide her with a lifetime of effortless, elite luxury. Now that she knew the truth, that the money belonged exclusively to the black maintenance worker she deeply despised, she wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. She zipped her suitcases shut, pushed past him without a single ounce of hesitation, and walked out the front door, calling an expensive rideshare service to take her away from the mess she helped create. Only 4 days later, a man in a cheap suit knocked on the door of the mansion. Andre, who was sitting in the dark because the electric company had just shut off the power, opened the door and was handed a thick stack of legal documents. Khloe had officially filed for a highly aggressive divorce. Even though she knew Andre had absolutely $0 to his name, her entitlement was so deeply ingrained that she could not comprehend the reality of the situation. Her sleazy lawyer had drafted a petition demanding exorbitant monthly alimony payments and spousal support, to maintain the standard of living she had grown accustomed to. She was demanding thousands of dollars a month from a man who was currently eating canned soup in the dark and waiting for the sheriff's department to execute a final eviction order. The absolute absurdity of her demands proved exactly how delusional she truly was. She thought she could squeeze blood from a stone. She did not realize that the stone belonged to me, and she was never getting another dime. Khloe thought she had executed the perfect escape plan. She had immediately moved into the luxurious downtown penthouse of a wealthy man she knew from her exclusive tennis club. He drove a flashy sports car, wore expensive watches, and promised to take care of her while her divorce from Andre played out in court. Khloe posted pictures online bragging about her new upgraded life, trying to prove she was untouchable. But true karma has a beautiful way of striking when the arrogant feel the safest. Just 3 weeks after she moved in, Khloe woke up to the sound of loud, aggressive banging on the penthouse door. It was not a process server this time. It was a raid team from the Federal Internal Revenue Service, accompanied by armed federal agents. The wealthy tennis club man was a massive fraud. He had been running an illegal tax evasion scheme for nearly a decade. The agents swarmed the penthouse, seizing every single asset inside. They confiscated the furniture, the electronics, the expensive watches, and even the designer bags Khloe had brought with her, claiming they were purchased with illicit funds. The agents ordered Khloe to vacate the premises immediately, as the entire property was being seized by the federal government. She stood on the sidewalk in the freezing Chicago wind, holding a single plastic grocery bag of her remaining clothes. She had no cars, no bank accounts, no husband, and no wealthy boyfriend. She was completely homeless, standing in the exact same cold streets her grandfather had gleefully predicted I would end up in. The universe had delivered the exact punishment she had wished upon me. Vivien walked out of the county courthouse a completely shattered and humiliated woman. The massive, crushing weight of my elite legal fees was resting heavily on her shoulders, pulling her down into a dark reality she completely refused to accept. She had fully expected to leave that stone building as a newly minted multimillionaire ready to parade her stolen wealth around her arrogant friends. But instead, she walked out with a towering mountain of debt that would easily take 3 lifetimes for a normal person to pay off. She was terrified down to her very core, but her blinding narcissistic arrogance refused to let her admit total defeat. She convinced herself she still had her ultimate backup plan. She still had the sophisticated, wealthy investor she had proudly bragged about at our Christmas dinner. His name was Richard, and he was everything she thought I was not. He was a smooth-talking, charismatic man who wore bespoke Italian suits, drove a loud rented luxury sports car, and always ordered the most expensive champagne on the menu just to show off to the waiters. Vivien rushed straight from the courthouse to the upscale boutique hotel where Richard was supposedly renting a lavish executive suite. She desperately needed him to be her savior. She needed his vast financial resources to wipe away the humiliating legal defeat she had just suffered at the hands of a quiet black maintenance worker. When she arrived at the plush hotel suite, she threw herself into his arms and sobbed uncontrollably like a helpless child. She told him that the judge was biased and incredibly corrupt. She lied through her teeth and claimed that I had used dirty corporate tricks to steal her rightful marital assets. Richard played his role flawlessly, like an actor who had rehearsed this exact scene 100 times before. He poured her a heavy glass of imported red wine, gently stroked her hair, and whispered exactly what her fragile ego desperately wanted to hear. He told her that my trust fund meant absolutely nothing because he was going to build her an even bigger and better empire. Vivien clung to his empty promises like a drowning woman clinging to a fragile life raft in a hurricane. She convinced herself that losing my money was simply a minor temporary setback. She truly believed Richard was a titan of industry who would effortlessly write a massive check to cover her new legal debts and keep her wrapped in the elite luxury she felt she inherently deserved. She spent the entire weekend hiding in that hotel suite, drinking expensive wine and completely ignoring the frantic, desperate phone calls from her father, Harlon, and her son, Andre. She insulated herself in a beautiful temporary lie. She looked at Richard and saw her golden ticket right back into high society. She did not realize she was looking directly at a highly trained financial predator who specifically specialized in hunting desperate, arrogant women. He knew exactly how to mirror her extreme entitlement and feed her fragile ego, making her feel incredibly smart and savvy. He played the role of the perfect wealthy gentleman, masking his true predatory nature behind a charming smile and expensive dinners paid for by his previous victims. Vivien was so blinded by her hatred for me and her desire to maintain her upper-class illusion that she completely ignored every single red flag staring her right in the face. A few days later, Richard sat Vivien down at the sleek glass dining table in the hotel suite. He looked incredibly serious and intensely focused, putting on the perfect performance of a stressed business tycoon. He opened a modern silver laptop and showed her a series of complex-looking financial charts and colorful real estate portfolios that he had likely downloaded directly from the internet. He told her he had secured the exclusive development rights to a massive commercial property in a rapidly gentrifying downtown Chicago neighborhood. He confidently claimed the project was guaranteed to triple in value within the first 6 months of construction. But then he sighed heavily and rubbed his temples, acting deeply frustrated by an unexpected bureaucratic obstacle. He explained that his primary liquid assets were temporarily tied up in a massive offshore acquisition that was taking much longer than expected to clear international customs and banking regulations. He told Vivien that he needed a sudden injection of bridge capital to secure the strict real estate permits by the end of the week. He stressed that if he missed the deadline, the entire multi-million-dollar deal would collapse and they would lose their chance at unimaginable wealth. Richard looked deeply into Vivien's eyes, held her hands softly, and told her that if she could just provide the temporary bridge funding, he would add her name directly to the master deed of the new property. He promised her that this single investment would generate enough immediate cash flow to pay off every single dollar of the legal fees she owed me. Vivien was completely blinded by her own uncontrollable greed and absolute desperation. She wanted so badly to prove she was a brilliant financial mind. She did not ask to consult a lawyer or a certified accountant. She did not ask to see certified corporate documents or building permits. She only saw a magical escape hatch from her impending total bankruptcy. Vivien had a personal retirement account. It was a modest fund she had built up over the very few years she had actually bothered to work before deciding my maintenance worker salary was her personal unlimited allowance. It was the only actual money she legally owned in her own name, and it held roughly $85,000. It was her absolute last safety net in the entire world. Without a single ounce of hesitation, Vivien logged into her financial banking portal. She liquidated the entire retirement account willingly, absorbing massive early withdrawal penalties and taxes just to get the liquid cash immediately. Her bank actually flagged the transaction, and a representative called her to warn her about wire fraud, but Vivien arrogantly yelled at the employee and demanded they release her funds. She wired every single remaining dollar she possessed directly into a random routing number Richard provided. When the transfer cleared, Vivien felt a massive surge of victorious adrenaline. She genuinely believed she had just outsmarted me and the entire legal system. She thought she was about to become an independent real estate tycoon, and that she would soon be laughing at my family trust fund. She handed over her entire future to a man she had known for barely 4 months. She did not realize that the colorful charts and impressive building blueprints he showed her were just generic stock images downloaded from a public architecture website. She was so desperate to escape the reality of her crushing courtroom defeat that she willingly jumped completely blindfolded into a massive financial abyss. She actually smiled as she watched her account balance drop to zero, honestly believing she was planting the seeds of a brand new billion-dollar empire that would finally rival my own hidden wealth. The devastating reality of her fatal mistake did not take very long to arrive. Just 48 hours after Vivien wired the money, she woke up in the hotel suite and found it completely silent and entirely empty. Richard's expensive leather travel bags were gone. His designer clothes were cleared out of the massive walk-in closet, leaving only empty wooden hangers. Even his expensive colognes and toiletries had vanished without a trace from the marble bathroom. Vivien felt a sudden cold knot form deep in the pit of her stomach. She grabbed her phone and quickly dialed his private personal number. The call did not even ring once. A cold, automated voice message mechanically informed her that the cellular number she was trying to reach had been permanently disconnected and was no longer in service. Panic instantly seized her entire body, making her chest physically ache. Her hands shook violently as she tried calling him on every social messaging application she had downloaded, but his profiles were entirely deleted. He had wiped his digital footprint completely clean off the face of the earth. Desperate and hyperventilating, Vivien threw on a coat and rushed down to the hotel lobby. She demanded the front desk clerk tell her where Richard had gone. The clerk looked at her with pity and informed her that the credit card on file for the room had just bounced, and the luxury sports car he drove was a short-term rental that had been returned that morning. Vivien rushed out to her own car and drove recklessly toward the prestigious downtown address Richard had claimed was his global corporate headquarters. When she arrived at the towering glass building, she ran to the front security desk and demanded to see him. The guard looked at her with polite confusion. He checked the building registry and calmly informed her that no such investment firm existed anywhere on the premises. The address Richard had provided was nothing more than a temporary virtual mail drop location. Anyone could rent it for $50 a month just to look legitimate on paper. The luxurious investor, the man she had sacrificed a 40-year marriage for the man who was supposed to save her from the ruins of my courtroom victory, was a professional career con artist. He was a real-life swindler who actively preyed on older, wealthy-looking divorcees who were too arrogant to see the truth. He had identified Vivien at a local country club mixer, seen her dripping in pearls, and targeted her as an easy, vulnerable mark. The second the $85,000 hit his untraceable offshore account, he packed his bags and vanished into thin air like a ghost. Vivien stumbled out of the corporate building and collapsed heavily onto a cold concrete bench on the sidewalk. She stared blankly at the busy Chicago traffic moving past her, unable to comprehend the magnitude of her failure. She had absolutely nothing left in the world. Her husband was gone. Her son was financially ruined. Her court case was an unmitigated disaster. She owed me hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, and now her final $85,000 safety net was permanently stolen. She was completely, utterly, and hopelessly destitute. The icy winter wind whipped around her, freezing her to the bone, but she could not bring herself to stand up. She realized in that crushing, lonely moment that her own father Harlon had been completely wrong about everything. I was not the one who was going to end up homeless and freezing on the streets of Chicago. She was. The absolute arrogance that had fueled her entire existence had finally betrayed her, leaving her stranded on a cold sidewalk with no money, no family, and absolutely no one left to blame but herself. Harlon was 92 years old, and his entire identity was built on a solid foundation of unearned superiority and blinding racial arrogance. For over 50 years, he had run a mid-sized logistics and freight company on the industrial outskirts of Chicago. He built his business during an era when a white man with a loud voice and a country club membership could easily secure massive bank loans over a quick game of golf and a glass of expensive scotch. He ran his company like a ruthless dictator, exploiting cheap labor and cutting every possible corner while paying himself an exorbitant executive salary. He firmly believed he was an untouchable titan of industry. Even after witnessing his daughter Vivien spectacularly lose her divorce battle and acquire massive legal debt, Harlon remained entirely convinced that his own personal empire was absolutely invincible. He sat in his dark oak-paneled office smoking a premium imported cigar and looking down at his busy warehouse floor. He felt a deep sense of arrogant satisfaction, believing he was still the undisputed king of his castle. But Harlon's ancient business model was rotting from the inside out. He had spent the last decade using his company as a personal piggy bank, draining the corporate accounts to fund his lavish lifestyle and his expensive country club dues. To keep the freight trucks running, he had taken out massive high-interest commercial loans, leveraging every single warehouse and shipping contract he owned as collateral. He always assumed that his white hair, his tailored suits, and his elite social connections would permanently protect him from any real financial consequences. So when his ancient fax machine printed out an urgent legal notice from his primary commercial lenders, Harlon did not even blink. It was a massive margin call. The lenders were demanding an immediate cash injection of $4 million to cover the rapidly depreciating value of his collateral assets. Harlon picked up the paper, read the astronomical number, and actually laughed out loud. He tossed the formal legal demand straight into his heavy brass trash can. He took another long drag of his cigar and smiled. He arrogantly assumed it was just a minor clerical error, or an overly aggressive young bank manager trying to make a name for himself. He thought he could simply pick up his office telephone, call one of his old golfing buddies at the regional bank, and easily restructure the debt over a nice steak dinner, just like he had done 100 times before. He had absolutely no idea that the banking world he used to control had completely evolved, and his old golf buddies were no longer running the show. The very next morning, the arrogant smile was violently wiped completely off Harlon's wrinkled face. He sat at his heavy mahogany desk and dialed the private numbers of his most trusted banking connections. One by one, his calls were either sent directly to voicemail or answered by nervous assistants who politely informed him that the senior partners were permanently unavailable. When he finally managed to get a sympathetic bank manager on the phone, the news he received hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The manager apologetically explained that the bank no longer owned Harlon's commercial paper. The bank had quietly bundled his massive toxic debt along with several other high-risk loans and sold the entire portfolio to an aggressive private equity holding company. The manager told Harlon that this new holding company was completely ruthless. They had immediately called in all the outstanding markers and explicitly refused to entertain any offers for refinancing or debt restructuring. Harlon was entirely out of time and out of options. Harlon slammed the phone down so hard the plastic receiver cracked. His chest heaved with a mixture of sheer panic and blinding indignant rage. He could not fathom how a faceless corporate entity dared to treat a man of his elevated social standing like a common delinquent debtor. He demanded respect, and he was determined to force them to give it to him. He received a secondary certified letter that afternoon officially stating that if the $4 million margin call was not fully satisfied within 48 hours, the holding company would legally seize all of his operational assets. They would take his warehouses, his trucks, his corporate accounts, and his personal pension. They were going to liquidate his entire 50-year legacy to recoup their money. Harlon refused to let his life work be swallowed by anonymous corporate suits. He put on his absolute best tailored charcoal suit, polished his expensive leather shoes, and grabbed his heavy wooden cane. He ordered his personal driver to take him directly to the towering glass and steel headquarters of the holding company listed on the foreclosure notice. He was fully prepared to march right into their executive boardroom, slam his cane on the table, and bully whoever was in charge into granting him a 5-year extension. He still honestly believed his loud voice and his arrogant intimidation tactics would easily bend the modern world to his will. Harlon arrived at the towering corporate skyscraper in the heart of downtown Chicago. The building was a modern fortress of gleaming glass and polished black marble. He stepped out of his car, leaning heavily on his cane, and walked through the massive revolving doors with a look of fierce, determined entitlement. He approached the pristine front security desk and loudly demanded to speak directly with the chief executive officer of the holding company. The security guards did not flinch at his arrogant tone. They simply checked his identification, scanned his visitor pass, and directed him to a private, dedicated elevator that went straight to the top-floor boardroom. Harlon rode the elevator up, feeling a familiar surge of adrenaline. He rehearsed his aggressive speech in his head, preparing to intimidate the young, arrogant finance workers he assumed were running the firm. He expected to see a room full of terrified junior executives who would immediately bow to his age and his supposed business acumen. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, quiet chime. Harlon stepped out onto the plush carpet of the executive floor. He walked down a quiet, dimly lit hallway toward a massive set of frosted glass double doors. He pushed the heavy doors open and stepped into a sprawling, state-of-the-art corporate boardroom. The room was surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking, dizzying view of the entire city. At the far end of the massive polished mahogany table sat a single high-backed leather executive chair turned entirely away from the door facing the sprawling Chicago skyline. Harlon slammed his heavy wooden cane against the hardwood floor, creating a loud echoing crack designed to demand absolute attention. He barked out an order demanding that whoever was sitting in that chair turn around and negotiate with him immediately. He shouted that he was a powerful man and he did not take orders from faceless cowards hiding behind corporate letterheads. The leather chair slowly, silently swiveled around to face the center of the room. Harlon stopped breathing completely. The blood instantly drained from his wrinkled face, leaving him as pale as a ghost. His 92-year-old knees suddenly felt incredibly weak, and he had to grip his wooden cane with both hands just to keep himself from physically collapsing onto the floor. Sitting perfectly relaxed at the head of the boardroom table, wearing a flawless dark suit and looking at him with absolute stone-cold indifference, was me. The black maintenance worker he had laughed at. The man he had told to go live under a bridge during Christmas dinner. The man he had spent 40 years relentlessly degrading at every single family gathering. I did not smile. I did not raise my voice. I simply folded my hands on the polished mahogany table and looked deeply into his terrified wide eyes. I told him in a calm, chillingly quiet voice that he was not standing in front of a faceless corporate entity. I told him that Sterling Heritage Holdings, the private trust fund established by my uncle in 1969, was the primary majority shareholder of the exact private equity firm that had just purchased his toxic, miserable debt. I watched the devastating reality crush the last remaining breath out of his lungs. He finally understood that I had not just defeated Vivien in court. I had methodically, legally, and brutally purchased the entire financial foundation of his life. Harlon opened his mouth, but his voice was completely gone. He tried to speak, to apologize, to beg for mercy, but only a pathetic, raspy wheeze escaped his throat. I did not let him say a single word. I leaned forward and delivered the final, fatal blow to his arrogant existence. I told him that for 40 years I had sat at his dining table and swallowed his racist insults, his arrogant mockery, and his profound disrespect. I told him that he had spent his entire life believing his skin color and his country club memberships made him a superior human being. But today, right now in my boardroom, the only color that mattered was the red ink on his massive defaulted loans. I picked up a sleek black pen, the exact same pen I had used to sign Vivien's divorce papers on Christmas Eve. I pulled his corporate foreclosure documents toward me. I looked at the old trembling man one last time and told him that his extensions were denied, his company was officially liquidated, and his entire 50-year legacy now belonged exclusively to me. I signed my name with a slow, deliberate flourish, finalizing the total legal seizure of everything he had ever worked for. I set the pen down, pressed a button on my desk, and 2 large security guards immediately entered the boardroom. I instructed them to escort the bankrupt, trespassing old man out of my building and to make sure he took the public bus home because his corporate car had just been repossessed. Harlon let out a broken, devastating sob. He turned around, his pride completely shattered, his empire reduced to absolute ashes, and limped slowly out of the room, leaning heavily on his cane, a totally ruined and broken man. The freezing Chicago wind howled through the concrete canyons of the downtown financial district, whipping violently against the towering glass facade of the Sterling Heritage Holdings headquarters. It was a bleak, unforgiving afternoon. The gray sky perfectly matched the absolute despair of the 3 figures slowly shuffling toward the massive revolving doors. Vivien, Harlon, and Andre walked together not as a proud, wealthy family, but as a pathetic collection of completely broken individuals. They had absolutely nowhere else to go. Every single door in their lives had been firmly slammed shut and locked. Vivien was shivering uncontrollably. She was no longer wearing her expensive, tailored crimson dresses or her heavy pearl necklaces. She was wrapped in a cheap, thin winter coat she had bought at a discount store after the smooth-talking investor completely drained her retirement accounts and vanished into thin air. Her face was pale and drawn, deeply etched with the severe stress of her mounting legal debts and her sudden, terrifying homelessness. Andre walked a few steps behind his mother, looking like a hollow shell of a man. His designer clothes were gone, replaced by mismatched layers of whatever he could salvage before the bank officially seized his suburban mansion. He kept his head bowed, staring at his scuffed shoes, completely stripped of the arrogant entitlement he used to display when he was spending my money. Harlon brought up the rear, leaning heavily on his wooden cane. The 92-year-old man looked incredibly frail and entirely defeated. His booming, authoritative voice and his racist arrogance had been entirely crushed the day I foreclosed on his 50-year-old logistics company. His expensive suits hung loosely on his shrinking frame, and his hands trembled violently as he struggled to keep up with his daughter and grandson. They approached the pristine front entrance of my corporate fortress, looking exactly like what they truly were, which was a group of desperate beggars hoping for a miracle. They pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped into the sprawling, immaculate marble lobby. The sheer scale of the building was deeply intimidating. The vaulted ceilings, the polished stone floors, and the quiet hum of immense corporate wealth surrounded them instantly, making them feel incredibly small and insignificant. They walked timidly toward the main security desk. The guards on duty were highly trained professionals wearing crisp, dark suits. They immediately recognized the 3 miserable figures approaching them. My security team had been given very strict, detailed instructions regarding any uninvited visits from my former family members. Vivien approached the lead guard, her voice shaking as she pleaded for a few minutes of my time. She told the guard that it was an absolute emergency and that she desperately needed to speak with her husband. The guard did not correct her delusion. He simply picked up his secure telephone and dialed the direct line to my top-floor penthouse office. I was sitting comfortably at my massive mahogany desk reviewing a quarterly financial report when the call came through. The head of security calmly informed me that 3 individuals matching the descriptions of my ex-wife, my son, and my former father-in-law were currently standing in the lobby and begging for an audience. I did not feel a single spike of anger or anxiety. I simply took a slow sip of my hot black coffee, closed my leather-bound portfolio, and told the security chief to make them wait exactly 15 minutes before I came down. I wanted them to stand there in the freezing draft of the lobby doors, feeling the burning humiliation of being treated like unwanted trespassers in a building owned by the man they had relentlessly mocked. I wanted the reality of their massive downfall to sink deeply into their bones. When the 15 minutes had passed, I stood up, buttoned my perfectly tailored navy blue suit jacket, and walked toward the private executive elevator. The ride down to the ground floor was smooth and entirely silent. I watched the digital floor numbers count down, feeling a profound sense of absolute closure. I was descending from my untouchable fortress to finally sweep away the last remaining pieces of my toxic past. The polished steel doors of the elevator slid open with a soft chime echoing clearly across the vast marble lobby. I stepped out slowly, my hands resting calmly at my sides. My security team instantly flanked me, standing at attention with their hands clasped in front of them, creating a physical and psychological barrier between me and the three desperate people standing a few feet away. Vivien saw me and completely broke down. The tiny shred of pride she had been desperately clinging to completely evaporated. She did not walk toward me. She physically collapsed, dropping heavily onto her knees right there on the cold, polished marble floor. She began to sob loudly, her cries echoing pitifully off the high glass walls. She clasped her hands together and started begging for my forgiveness. She told me she had been incredibly stupid and completely blinded by a foolish fantasy. She confessed that the wealthy investor she left me for was a massive fraud who had stolen her entire life savings and abandoned her in a hotel room. She pleaded with me to remember our 40 years of marriage. She cried that she was so terrified of being homeless and destitute at 70 years old. She begged me to let her come back home, promising that she would be a devoted, obedient wife and that she would never, ever disrespect me again. She groveled on the floor, looking up at me with desperate red eyes, hoping to find a single ounce of the submissive, generous maintenance worker she used to easily manipulate. Andre stood frozen behind her, his face completely bathed in silent tears. He did not have the courage to step forward or to defend his mother. He just kept repeating the word "Dad" over and over again in a weak, pathetic whisper. He looked like a frightened, lost child, hoping his father would magically swoop in and fix the massive disaster his life had become. He wanted me to rescue him from his impending divorce, his financial ruin, and his absolute lack of purpose. Harlon was the most pathetic sight of them all. The racist 92-year-old tyrant who had boldly laughed in my face at Christmas dinner and told me I belonged under a bridge could not even bring himself to look up. He stared intently at the marble floor, leaning his entire body weight on his wooden cane. His pride had been so thoroughly and violently shattered by my corporate takeover that he was completely incapable of making eye contact with a successful black man. He stood there silently shaking, accepting the harsh reality that he was entirely at my mercy and that his decades of unearned superiority meant absolutely nothing. I stood perfectly still and watched them. I did not raise my voice to shout at Vivien. I did not hurl insults at Harlon or express bitter disappointment toward Andre. Anger is a volatile emotion that signals a lack of control, and I was in absolute total control. I looked down at Vivien's tear-stained face and felt nothing but a vast, empty indifference. Her tears were not born out of genuine remorse for how she had treated my humanity. Her tears were solely generated by her terrifying lack of money. If the fake investor had actually been a billionaire, she would still be laughing at me at her elite country club. She was only apologizing because she had completely run out of options. The silence I offered them was heavier and more suffocating than any screaming match could ever be. I let the quiet tension fill the massive lobby, forcing them to sit in the uncomfortable, agonizing reality of their own spectacular failure. I slowly reached out my hand toward my head of security. He immediately stepped forward and placed a thick, heavy object directly into my palm. It was a large, sealed manila folder. The visual poetry of the moment was absolutely deliberate. I held the folder in my hand, letting Vivien see it clearly through her pathetic tears. It was the exact same size and shape as the thick manila envelope she had so arrogantly slammed down onto my plate at the Michelin-starred restaurant on Christmas Eve. That night, she had handed me divorce papers wrapped in a manila folder to publicly humiliate me and strip away my dignity. Today I was handing her a manila folder to permanently seal her ultimate destruction. I did not gloat. I did not smile a victorious, arrogant smile. I simply took one slow, measured step forward and extended my arm. I held the thick manila folder out toward Vivien while she remained kneeling on the cold floor. Her sobbing hitched in her throat. She looked at the folder with wide, desperate eyes. For a brief, foolish second, a flicker of hope washed over her pale face. She actually believed that the folder might contain a generous financial settlement. She thought that perhaps my 40 years of quiet submission meant I had finally taken pity on her and drafted a legal agreement to pay off her massive debts and provide her with a comfortable monthly allowance. She reached out with violently trembling hands and took the heavy folder from my grasp, her fingers brushing against the rough paper. She clutched the folder to her chest, letting out a ragged, breathless sigh of profound relief. She thanked me repeatedly, her voice shaking with pathetic gratitude. She whispered that she knew I was a good, generous man who would never let his family starve on the streets. Andre wiped his eyes, looking hopeful for the first time in weeks while Harlon let out a long, shaky breath. They truly believed they had just been granted a miraculous multi-million-dollar pardon. They had absolutely no idea that I had not handed them a financial lifeline. I had just handed them the final, devastating legal anchor that was going to drag them straight down to the bottom of the ocean. The contents of that folder were going to unleash a terrifying federal nightmare they could not possibly escape. I stepped back, folded my hands behind my back, and watched Vivien slowly peel open the metal clasp, completely unaware that she was about to pull the pin on a massive legal grenade. Vivien peeled back the metal clasp of the heavy manila folder. Her hands were shaking with a pathetic kind of eager anticipation. She truly believed she was about to look at a lucrative settlement agreement or a generous alimony contract. She thought I was finally taking pity on her miserable existence. She pulled the thick stack of papers out and stared at the top page. I watched her eyes scan the header. It was not a legal settlement. It was a comprehensive forensic financial audit conducted by one of the most ruthless accounting firms in the entire country. She flipped to the second page, and her breath hitched sharply in her throat. Printed in high-resolution color were dozens of credit card statements from elite banking institutions. They were premium-tier accounts with massive spending limits. Vivien stared at the names on the accounts, and a deep, terrifying pale color washed over her face, completely draining away any remaining trace of hope. The accounts were all registered under my exact legal name and my personal social security number, but the mailing addresses and the authorized user signatures entirely belonged to her. For the past 5 years, while she was mocking my modest maintenance worker salary and complaining about our simple life, she had been actively committing massive financial crimes right under my nose. She had secretly used my pristine credit history and my social security number to open a complex web of hidden credit cards. She had funded her secret expensive lifestyle, purchasing designer clothes and booking lavish spa weekends behind my back. But the forensic audit went much deeper than her personal vanity purchases. My accounting team had traced the massive cash advances she had been pulling from those fraudulent accounts over the last several months. The documents clearly showed the undeniable paper trail, proving how she had funneled tens of thousands of stolen dollars directly into the offshore accounts of Richard, the smooth-talking scammer she had left me for. She had literally stolen my identity and committed severe financial fraud to finance the very man she used to humiliate me at our Christmas dinner. Vivien dropped the stack of papers onto the cold marble floor of the lobby as if they were literally burning her hands. The pages scattered across the polished stone, revealing highlighted bank transfers, forged signature comparisons, and digital login records tracing directly back to her personal computer. She looked up at me, and her eyes were completely wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. She finally understood that I had not handed her a financial lifeline to save her from poverty. I had handed her a meticulously documented prison sentence. She realized that I had known about her secret financial betrayal for weeks, and I had simply let her continue digging her own grave until the evidence was absolutely insurmountable. Andre looked down at the scattered papers near his mother's knees. He recognized the bank logos and the glaring red highlights detailing the fraudulent cash advances. He slowly realized the horrifying truth about the woman who had raised him. His mother was not just a greedy, arrogant socialite who had made a bad investment. She was a documented federal criminal who had systematically stolen from her own husband. Harlon leaned heavily on his wooden cane, staring at the undeniable proof of his daughter's felony crimes. The racist 92-year-old man who had spent his entire life bragging about his superior pedigree was now staring at the absolute moral bankruptcy of his own bloodline. They were completely paralyzed by the sudden crushing weight of the evidence surrounding them on the floor. I stepped slightly closer to them, ensuring my voice would carry clearly in the quiet, echoing space of the massive corporate lobby. I did not raise my voice or show any trace of anger. I spoke with the calm, chilling authority of a man who holds absolute power over the lives of his enemies. I told Vivien to listen to me very carefully because I was only going to say these words to her one single time. I explained that what she had done over the past 5 years was not a simple marital dispute or a minor civil matter. I told her it was aggravated identity theft and federal wire fraud. I calmly informed her that the exact documents currently resting by her knees carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary for a woman her age. I watched her body physically tremble as the reality of a decade behind bars crashed into her fragile mind. I looked down at her tear-stained face and delivered my final, absolute terms. You have exactly 24 hours to leave this city. I spoke the words slowly, letting each syllable land like a heavy stone. I told her that she, Andre, and Harlon were to pack whatever pathetic belongings they had left and disappear from Chicago entirely. I laid out the absolute boundary of their continued existence. If I ever see your face again, if I ever hear your voice on a phone call, if I ever receive a text message, a letter, or a message through a lawyer from any of you for the rest of my natural life, this entire folder goes directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I told her that my corporate attorneys had already prepared the criminal referral package, and all it took was one single phone call from me to send federal agents to her door. The ultimatum hung in the freezing air of the lobby like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. I told them that they were going to spend the rest of their miserable lives looking over their shoulders, knowing that their physical freedom depended entirely on my continuing silence. They were going to live in complete poverty and absolute obscurity, knowing that any attempt to contact me or demand a single penny from my estate would result in their immediate arrest. I told Andre that his fake suburban life was over and he was going to have to work minimum wage jobs just to survive. I told Harlon that he was going to die in a state-funded facility completely forgotten by the society he used to rule. I told them that their punishment was not just losing my wealth, but having to live every single day, knowing they threw away an empire because of their own disgusting arrogance and bottomless greed. The total collapse of their reality was instantaneous and absolute. They were completely broken, stripped of every single defense mechanism they had ever relied on. They were not just entirely broke and homeless anymore. Their actual physical freedom was now hanging by a microscopic thread, held firmly by the very man they had discarded like garbage. Vivien let out a strangled, pathetic gasp, trying to gather the scattered papers from the marble floor with violently shaking hands. She stuffed the damning evidence back into the manila folder, terrified that one of my security guards might snatch it away and call the police right then and there. She scrambled awkwardly to her feet, stumbling and nearly falling over her own cheap winter coat. She did not say another word. She did not beg for forgiveness or try to negotiate a better deal. She knew that any further attempt to manipulate me would instantly trigger the destruction of her freedom. She grabbed Andre's arm, pulling him roughly toward the exit. Andre looked at me one last time, his face a mask of total devastation and profound regret, but I simply stared right through him, offering absolutely zero comfort or redemption. He turned away, his shoulders slumped under the heavy weight of his new, bleak reality. Harlon struggled to turn around, his old bones, aching, his pride entirely decimated. The old man who had laughed at me on Christmas Eve now had to shuffle painfully toward the revolving doors, knowing he was walking out into a cold, unforgiving world that no longer cared about his name or his past status. The security guards stood perfectly still in their dark suits, watching the pathetic procession of defeated villains retreat from the building. They scrambled out of the lobby, pushing through the heavy glass doors like frightened rats fleeing a sinking ship. I watched through the towering glass walls as they stepped out into the freezing, harsh Chicago wind. They huddled together on the icy sidewalk, a broken, destitute family with absolutely no money, no power, and no future. I stood in the warmth of my immaculate corporate lobby, feeling a profound and permanent sense of peace wash over my entire soul. The toxic poison that had infected my life for 4 decades was finally and completely eradicated. I turned my back on the freezing street, walked calmly toward my private executive elevator, and pressed the button to return to my penthouse, closing this dark chapter of my life forever. 6 months passed since that freezing winter afternoon in my corporate lobby. The turning of the seasons brought a warm, beautiful spring to the city of Chicago, but it brought nothing but a harsh, freezing reality to the people who had tried to destroy me. I did not have to actively monitor them to know exactly how far they had fallen. My private investigators routinely provided me with brief, comprehensive updates just to ensure my strict legal boundaries were being respected. Reading those reports was not an exercise in petty vengeance. It was a quiet confirmation that the universe has an incredibly precise way of balancing its scales. Let us start with Andre, my 40-year-old son who once wore $3,000 bespoke suits and drove a silver Porsche. Today, Andre works the grueling graveyard shift at a rundown 24-hour gas station on the desolate outskirts of the city. The customized Italian wool he used to drape over his shoulders has been permanently replaced by a stiff, itchy polyester uniform with his name printed on a cheap plastic tag. He spends his nights standing under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights, ringing up stale coffee and cheap cigarettes for exhausted truck drivers and impatient travelers. There are no more lavish business lunches. There are no more expensive golf outings. He sweeps the sticky linoleum floors and empties overflowing trash cans out in the freezing rain. He rents a tiny, dilapidated room in a boarding house that smells permanently of damp wood and old cooking grease. Every single time he looks down at his hands, he sees the growing calluses and the dirt trapped under his fingernails. He has plenty of time during those long, agonizing night shifts to stand behind the bulletproof glass and think about his choices. He thinks about that Christmas dinner at the Michelin-starred restaurant. He remembers how he stared at his mashed potatoes in absolute silence, while his wife and his grandfather stripped away my human dignity. He realizes now, with crushing clarity, that his cowardice was the most expensive mistake of his entire life. He traded a billionaire father for a fake suburban illusion, and now he is paying off that debt one minimum wage hour at a time. Khloe experienced an equally spectacular descent into absolute misery. The woman who haughtily declared she would never let her children visit me in the slums is now living exactly where she claimed to despise. After her fake wealthy tennis club boyfriend was raided by federal agents, she was left completely homeless with absolutely zero marketable job skills. She currently resides in a cramped, moldy studio apartment in one of the most neglected neighborhoods in the city. The heating barely works, and the thin walls offer no protection from the constant noise of the street. Khloe no longer glides into the driver's seat of a pristine white Range Rover. She wakes up before dawn every single morning, puts on a worn-out coat, and walks 4 blocks in the freezing wind to catch a crowded public city bus. She stands shoulder to shoulder with the hard-working working-class people she spent her entire life aggressively looking down upon. She clutches a cheap imitation handbag holding tightly to the metal grab rail as the bus violently jolts through the morning traffic. Her elite country club friends completely erased her number from their phones the exact second her eviction became public knowledge. She is a total ghost in the high society circles she used to aggressively worship. She spends her miserable days working as a low-level receptionist at a highly stressful dental clinic, answering phones and being verbally abused by angry patients. She is forced to swallow her immense pride every single hour of the day, realizing that her perceived racial and social superiority means absolutely nothing when you do not have a single dollar to your name. And then there is Harlon, the racist 92-year-old tyrant who laughed in my face and gleefully told me a black maintenance worker belonged under a dirty bridge. Harlon did not end up under a bridge, but his current reality is arguably a fate much worse for a man of his blinding arrogance. When I foreclosed on his 50-year-old logistics empire and liquidated every single asset he owned, his massive financial debts entirely wiped out his personal estate. He was forcibly relocated to a dismal, severely understaffed state-funded nursing home on the far south side of the city. The facility is a depressing labyrinth of peeling linoleum floors, flickering overhead lights, and the permanent lingering smell of bleach and boiled cabbage. Harlon sits all day in a cheap vinyl wheelchair, staring blankly at a muted television screen in a crowded common room. He is no longer the booming, authoritative chief executive officer who could terrify bank managers and demand immediate respect. He is just another forgotten ward of the state. When he presses the plastic call button pinned to his thin hospital gown, it sometimes takes over an hour for an exhausted, overworked nurse to even acknowledge him. The wealthy elite friends he used to smoke expensive imported cigars with never come to visit him. He is entirely surrounded by the very same marginalized people he spent 92 years actively discriminating against. He sits in his lonely shared room listening to the coughing and the shuffling of strangers, entirely stripped of his pride, his company, and his false sense of supremacy. He is living out his final days as a completely powerless and irrelevant man. But perhaps the most poetic justice of all belongs to Vivien, my former wife who thought she could blindly steal my identity, commit massive federal fraud, and walk away into a glorious sunset with a professional scam artist. True to my strict ultimatum, Vivien packed her pathetic remaining belongings and fled across the state line into neighboring Indiana before the 24-hour deadline expired. She knew with absolute certainty that if she stayed a second longer, my corporate legal team would hand that thick manila folder directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Today, Vivien is 70 years old, and she is working as a part-time checkout cashier at a heavily discounted grocery store. The woman who used to drape herself in heavy pearl necklaces and mock my blue-collar uniform now wears an ugly green vest and a visor. She stands on her aching, swollen feet for 8 hours a day scanning cheap canned beans and discounted loaves of bread. Her hands, which used to hold $200 glasses of imported red wine, are now cracked dry and heavily calloused from handling dirty, crumpled cash and breaking down thick cardboard boxes. She lives in a tiny, depressing rented trailer in a forgotten rural park miles away from any major city. But the physical labor and the extreme poverty are not her true punishment. Her ultimate punishment is the permanent, suffocating paranoia that deeply infects every single second of her miserable existence. The memory of that heavy manila folder acts as an invisible, terrifying chain wrapped tightly around her neck. She knows exactly what kind of damning federal evidence is locked inside my corporate vault. Every single time the automatic sliding glass doors of the grocery store open, she flinches, physically, bracing herself for the sight of federal agents walking in with a pair of steel handcuffs. Every time she hears the distant wail of a police siren while sitting in her dark trailer, her heart stops beating, and she struggles to catch her breath. She lives in a constant, agonizing state of pure, psychological terror. She cannot trust anyone. She cannot make any friends. She cannot apply for any government assistance programs or file any official paperwork because she is terrified that any digital footprint might accidentally trigger a background check that exposes her massive credit fraud. She traded 40 years of absolute security and a billionaire husband for a cheap illusion of superiority. Now she spends her golden years jumping at shadows and wiping down grocery conveyor belts, too terrified to even look her own customers in the eye. She knows that her physical freedom is not guaranteed. She knows it exists solely because I generously allow it to exist. She understands that she is living entirely on borrowed time and that one single mistake, one accidental phone call, or one attempt to return to Chicago will result in her immediate incarceration. The arrogant smirk she wore at that expensive restaurant is permanently gone. It has been entirely replaced by a hollow, trembling mask of perpetual fear. She has absolutely no money, no family, and no hope for a better tomorrow. I read the final page of the brief investigator report and gently tossed it into the paper shredder beside my mahogany desk. The soft mechanical whirring sound of the metal blades destroying the paper was the perfect conclusion to their miserable chapter. I did not feel any need to celebrate their extreme poverty or dance on the grave of their ruined reputations. They had built their own personal prisons brick by arrogant brick, and I simply provided them with the locks. I turned my chair to face the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. The sun was shining brightly over the beautiful blue waters of Lake Michigan. My mind was entirely clear, and my heart was incredibly light. The toxic debris of the last 4 decades had been completely swept away, leaving behind a pristine foundation for the rest of my life. I was 75 years old, but as I looked out over the empire I had quietly built, I felt like my life was truly just beginning. The morning sun rose over Lake Michigan, casting a warm golden glow across the polished hardwood floors of my penthouse. There was no screaming today. There were no arrogant demands for new cars or larger monthly allowances. There was only the soft, rhythmic sound of a classic jazz record playing on the vintage turntable in the corner of my expansive living room. For the first time in 4 decades, I woke up to a house that truly belonged to me in every possible way. I poured myself a fresh cup of dark roast coffee from the French press, breathing in the rich, earthy aroma. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the sprawling city of Chicago far below. The frantic, desperate energy of the millions of people rushing to work felt a million miles away from my quiet sanctuary. Down there in the bitter cold, my former family was fighting for their absolute daily survival. Vivien was scanning barcodes in a depressing rural grocery store, counting pennies. Andre was shivering at a desolate gas station wearing a cheap polyester uniform. Khloe was riding a crowded public bus, clutching her imitation handbag. Harlon was staring at a blank wall in a state-funded nursing home, completely forgotten by the world. But up here above the clouds, there was only absolute profound peace. I did not feel a single ounce of lingering anger or bitter resentment toward any of them. Anger is a heavy, toxic emotion that anchors you to the past, and I had officially cut that anchor forever. I felt completely detached from their suffering because they had dug their own graves with their bare hands, and I simply stopped tossing them ropes. The quiet in my home was a meticulously curated silence. The vibrant artwork on my walls reflected my actual African-American heritage and my personal tastes, not the sterile, pretentious suburban aesthetics Vivien used to force upon me. The heavy leather chair I sat in was perfectly molded to my back. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my hot coffee and let the warmth spread through my chest. The 40-year headache was permanently cured. I had spent my entire adult life wearing a heavy, suffocating mask of poverty and submission just to maintain a fragile peace with people who fundamentally despised my very existence. Taking that mask off was the most liberating physical sensation I had ever experienced in my 75 years on this earth. I was no longer the humble maintenance worker who kept his head down and swallowed brutal insults to keep his family intact. I was Leon Sterling. I was exactly the powerful man my visionary uncle had raised me to be. A silent, unmovable titan of industry. The space those greedy people had occupied in my mind for so many years was now completely empty, cleared of all the toxic debris of their endless manipulation. I sat in my perfect silence, feeling the steady, powerful beating of my own heart, knowing that the rest of my natural life would be lived entirely on my own terms. Later that afternoon, my lead corporate attorney, Ms. Davis, arrived at my penthouse carrying a thick leather portfolio. She did not bring me eviction notices or restraining orders today. She brought the architectural blueprints for the rest of my life and the future of my community. She laid a stack of pristine legal documents across my mahogany desk, smoothing out the crisp white pages. They were the finalized incorporation papers for the Sterling Heritage Foundation. I had instructed my elite financial team to permanently carve out $5 million in liquid capital directly from my primary trust accounts. This was the exact same pool of money Vivien and her sleazy divorce lawyer had aggressively tried to steal through the corrupt family court system. They wanted to use those millions to buy designer handbags, luxury European vacations, and sprawling suburban mansions. They wanted to use my hard-earned wealth to insulate themselves from the very people they aggressively looked down upon. Instead, I was taking that exact same $5 million and injecting it directly into the beating heart of the community they deeply despised. The foundation was specifically structured to operate as a massive educational scholarship fund and a state-of-the-art business incubator for young, underprivileged African-American entrepreneurs growing up on the south and west sides of Chicago. I wanted to find the brilliant, hungry young men and women who possessed the exact same relentless drive that my late uncle had when he built this real estate empire back in 1969. I wanted to find the kids who were currently being ignored, marginalized, and entirely underestimated by a financial system designed to keep them trapped at the absolute bottom. I picked up my favorite heavy black fountain pen and began signing the official foundation documents one by one. With every smooth stroke of my pen, I was fundamentally changing the trajectory of hundreds of young lives. I was paying for full university tuitions, covering expensive commercial business licenses, and providing massive zero-interest startup capital for minority-owned businesses. I was helping to build grocery stores, community centers, and advanced tech hubs in neighborhoods that had been historically redlined and abandoned by the major banking institutions. Miss Davis watched me sign the final page with a proud, knowing smile illuminating her face. She knew exactly what this profound moment meant to me. The generational wealth my uncle had bled for was no longer being quietly hoarded in secret offshore bank accounts or silently drained by ungrateful suburban parasites. It was finally being deployed as a massive financial weapon for social good. The millions of dollars that were supposed to fund Khloe's fake country club lifestyle were now going to build real lasting generational wealth for black families who actually deserved a seat at the table. I handed the signed legal documents back to Ms. Davis, feeling an immense, overwhelming sense of profound purpose. My empire was no longer just a defensive fortress designed to protect me from greedy relatives. It was now a powerful, thriving engine of limitless opportunity. A few weeks later, I was standing in the newly renovated downtown office space that served as the primary headquarters for our new business incubator. The large open room was buzzing with the bright electric energy of young, ambitious entrepreneurs working furiously on their laptops and sketching out complex business plans on large glass whiteboards. I walked slowly through the busy aisles, observing the incredible raw talent my foundation was currently funding. I stopped by a corner desk where a sharp 22-year-old man named Malik was aggressively typing on his computer keyboard. Malik was a brilliant software developer from the South Side who had just secured his first major round of seed funding from my trust. He was incredibly smart, but he carried a very heavy, angry chip on his shoulder. He looked up at me with deep frustration burning in his eyes. He started complaining loudly about a group of wealthy, arrogant downtown investors who had completely dismissed his software pitch earlier that week, specifically because of how he looked and the neighborhood he came from. He told me his blood was boiling. He said he wanted to take his new foundation funding, go right back to their pristine corporate offices, and aggressively rub his impending success right in their condescending faces. He wanted to buy a flashy, expensive sports car, wear custom-tailored suits, and force those arrogant men to respect him through sheer, loud intimidation. I listened to his passionate rant without interrupting. When he finally paused for a breath, I gently placed my hand on his shoulder and told him to close his laptop. I looked deeply into his young, angry eyes, seeing so much of my own early struggles reflected right back at me. I spoke to him in a low, steady voice, passing down the exact same vital wisdom my late uncle had given me over 50 years ago, when I was just a furious young man. I told Malik that true absolute power never needs to shout to be heard. I explained that when you aggressively flash your wealth and loudly demand respect, you are simply giving your enemies a clear, bright target to aim at. You are showing them exactly what you care about and exactly how they can destroy you. I leaned in closer and delivered the ultimate lesson of my entire 75 years of existence. I told him to always move in complete, absolute silence. I told him to wear the humble clothes, drive the quiet car, and let the arrogant world blindly assume he was just another ordinary man. Let your massive, overwhelming success be your only noise, I whispered to him. Let them constantly underestimate you. Let them mock you. Let them firmly believe they have the upper hand in every single interaction. Because when you move quietly in the shadows, you control the entire board without them even knowing a game is being played. And when the time finally comes, you do not ever have to fight them. You simply step back and let their own blinding greed be their ultimate spectacular downfall. Malik stared at me, completely absorbing the heavy, profound weight of those words. The aggressive, angry tension slowly melted away from his shoulders, replaced by a cold, sharp, mature understanding. He nodded, silently, opened his laptop, and quietly went back to building his empire. Late in the afternoon, on a quiet Sunday, I drove my car away from the bustling city center and headed toward the oldest cemetery on the south side of Chicago. The harsh, freezing winds of winter had finally surrendered to the soft, gentle warmth of a late spring afternoon. The trees were heavy with fresh green leaves, and the sky was an endless, unbroken expanse of bright blue. I walked slowly through the rolling hills of the cemetery, my footsteps making almost no sound on the freshly cut grass. I was not wearing my tailored navy suits today, and I was certainly not wearing the grease-stained maintenance overalls I had hidden behind for 40 long years. I wore a simple, comfortable sweater and dark trousers, feeling lighter than I had ever felt in my entire 75 years of life. I navigated the familiar winding stone paths until I reached a quiet, shaded corner beneath a massive, ancient oak tree. I stood in front of a modest, unassuming granite headstone. It did not have giant gold letters or flashy statues guarding it. It simply bore the name of my late uncle and the years he lived. The man who had fundamentally changed the entire trajectory of my bloodline rested here in complete, absolute silence. He was a man who built a sprawling commercial real estate empire back in the 1960s, when the entire financial system was aggressively designed to keep black men exactly like him permanently at the bottom. He fought through redlining corrupt banks and vicious discrimination to secure a fortress of generational wealth. And before he passed away, he handed me the keys to that exact same fortress with one strict heavy condition. He told me to protect it with my life and to never let anyone love me just for my money. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a heavy crystal flask filled with the most expensive aged bourbon money could buy. It was his absolute favorite drink. I unscrewed the silver cap and slowly poured a small, steady stream of the rich amber liquid directly onto the vibrant green grass resting over his grave. The sweet, sharp aroma of the bourbon filled the warm spring air, mixing with the scent of the earth. I stood there looking down at the carved stone, and I spoke to him in the quiet stillness of the cemetery. I told him that I had finally finished the job. I told him that the fortress he built in 1969 was completely secure and that it was now being used to lift up the next generation of our people just like he always wanted. I took a deep, slow breath and let my mind wander back over the last 4 decades of my life. For 40 years, I had played the role of the simple, foolish maintenance worker. I woke up every single morning long before the sun rose, putting on heavy, stiff work boots and shirts stained with industrial soap and grease. I let my wife Vivien and her deeply racist father Harlon look down on me. I sat at countless family dinner tables, swallowing their bitter insults, their condescending jokes, and their arrogant mockery. I watched my own son Andre grow up to be a weak, entitled man who was deeply ashamed of my dirty hands and my blue-collar uniform. I watched him marry Khloe, a woman whose entire existence was fueled by shallow suburban greed. For 40 years, I absorbed all of their toxic behavior with absolute silence. Playing the fool was the heaviest, most exhausting burden a man could ever carry. There were nights when the disrespect burned so deeply inside my chest that I wanted to slam my fists on the dining room table, pull out my bank statements, and scream at all of them to bow down to the billionaire sitting in their presence. But I never did. I remembered my uncle's wisdom, and I kept my mouth firmly shut. The dirty overalls were heavy, but they were the absolute perfect armor. They acted as a flawless filter that revealed the true dark character of every single person around me. Playing the poor janitor showed me exactly who Vivien was when she thought there was no money left to steal. It showed me exactly who Andre was when he thought his father had no power to defend himself. Now, standing under the shade of that massive oak tree, I realized the 40 years of silent suffering were entirely worth it. Taking off that heavy mask on Christmas Eve was the most profoundly liberating moment of my entire existence. I did not just lose a toxic wife and an ungrateful son. I gained my complete, absolute humanity back. I no longer had to shrink myself down to make insecure, greedy people feel larger. I no longer had to hide my intellect, my power, or my massive resources to keep the peace in a broken home. I was finally breathing crisp, clean air without the suffocating weight of their endless manipulation pressing down on my lungs. I looked out over the quiet, peaceful cemetery and thought about the people who had tried to destroy me. Vivien, Harlon, Andre, and Khloe were all out there somewhere in the world, currently drowning in the miserable, brutal consequences of their own spectacular arrogance. They had spent their entire lives obsessing over money and status, and now they had absolutely nothing. I did not wish them any physical harm, but I felt absolutely no pity for their self-inflicted downfall. They were no longer my problem. They were just ghosts fading into the background of a story I had already finished writing. I turned away from the modest granite headstone and began the long, peaceful walk back to my waiting car. The afternoon sun warmed my face, and the gentle spring breeze carried away the last remaining traces of my difficult past. I thought about the young entrepreneurs working in my new business incubator. I thought about the millions of dollars currently funding scholarships for brilliant kids who just needed a single chance to prove themselves. My life was no longer defined by enduring pain. It was completely defined by building a powerful, lasting legacy. I look at the world now with absolute crystal clarity, and I want anyone listening to this to understand the deepest truth about real power. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought the dirty overalls meant I had no power. But when you hold the keys to the kingdom, you do not need to kick down the door. You just lock it from the inside and watch them freeze. I am 75 years old. I am free. And I am just getting started. The greatest lesson from this story is that true wealth and power never need to announce themselves loudly. People who measure your worth by the clothes you wear or the job you do are only revealing their own shallow emptiness. When you treat others with disrespect and cruelty based on their perceived status, you are blinding yourself to reality. Kindness and respect should be given freely to everyone from the janitor to the chief executive officer. Greed will always blind you to the blessings you already have, and arrogance will eventually be the exact weapon that destroys your entire life. If you believe that karma always catches up with greedy people, let me know in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe for more powerful life stories.